Welcome. Settle yourself comfortably and allow the gentle pull of time to ease you backward through the centuries. Tonight, we journey to ancient Greece, to a world of marble columns catching the Mediterranean sun, of philosophical debates conducted in cool stone rooms, and of civilizations that laid the foundations of Western thought while observing customs and rituals that would seem utterly foreign to our modern sensibilities. As you listen, there is no need to remain alert or to remember every detail. Let the narrative wash over you like the warm Aegean breeze. We will recline, as the ancient Athenians did, in spaces reserved for leisure and contemplation. We will witness moments of triumph on distant battlefields, seek wisdom from oracular priestesses breathing strange vapors, and walk through the Agora, where democracy itself took its first uncertain steps. The world we visit tonight is one of stark contrasts, refined philosophy mixed with unrestrained indulgence. Glorious military victories shadowed by the realities of warfare, divine prophecy emerging from geological chance, and a sophisticated democratic culture built upon the backs of those excluded from its privileges. Let us begin, then, in the intimate setting of the Symposium, where elite men gathered after their evening meal to drink, to debate, and to reveal the complex social rituals that bound their world together. Imagine yourself reclining on a klein, a cushioned couch positioned along the walls of the andron, the men's quarters of a wealthy Athenian home. The meal has concluded. The tables have been cleared by household slaves, moving with practiced efficiency, their presence barely acknowledged by the guests who lounge in relaxed postures, supported by embroidered pillows. The andron is a carefully designed space, its walls painted with scenes from mythology, its floor constructed of smoothly fitted tiles, often waterproofed, a practical consideration for the activities that will unfold as the night progresses. You are one of perhaps a dozen men gathered here, all citizens of status and means. The Symposium, from the Greek sympeinein, meaning to drink together, is about to begin. This is not merely an occasion for casual consumption of wine. It is a ritualized social event, laden with expectations and governed by customs that separate the civilized Greek from the barbarian, the aristocrat from the common laborer. At the center of the room stands the crater, a large mixing vessel of burnished bronze or painted pottery. Wine in ancient Greece is never consumed undiluted. To do so would be considered uncivilized, the mark of a drunkard without self-control. Instead, the wine is mixed with water in carefully measured proportions, and it is the symposiarch, chosen for the evening, who determines the strength of the mixture. Perhaps tonight the ratio is 3 parts water to 2 parts wine, creating a beverage that will encourage conviviality without immediately overwhelming the senses. The symposiarch wields considerable authority. He sets the pace of drinking, proposes the topics of conversation, and ensures that the gathering proceeds with appropriate decorum, at least in its earlier stages. Young slave boys, often selected for their beauty, move among the couches with practiced grace, filling shallow kylix cups from the crater and presenting them to the reclining men. These boys are household property, trained to anticipate the needs of their master and his guests. Their presence is unremarkable to those gathered here, simply another element of the refined atmosphere that marks this as an elite gathering. The entertainment has already begun. A flute player, seated in the corner, produces a soft, meandering melody that fills the pauses in conversation. The sound of the aulos, the double-reeded flute, is haunting and slightly nasal, a familiar accompaniment to Greek social gatherings. Perhaps there is also a lyre player, plucking out complementary harmonies. The musicians are professionals, hired for the evening, and their skill is considerable. As the first cups of wine are consumed, the conversation begins to flow. Politics are a favored subject. Athens is a democracy, after all, and each man here participates in the assembly, votes on matters of war and peace, and considers himself a stakeholder in the city's fortunes. Someone mentions a recent debate in the Agora. Another comments on the performance of the generals. The talk is sophisticated, demonstrating the cultural refinement expected of men of your class. But you are not here solely for political discourse. The symposium serves multiple purposes, and as the wine begins to work its subtle alchemy upon the gathered company, the atmosphere shifts, becomes more relaxed, or playful. One of the guests proposes a round of kotabos, and the suggestion is met with enthusiastic approval. This drinking game, immensely popular at symposia, requires a certain degree of skill and offers an opportunity for display and for flirtation. The basic principle is simple. You recline on your couch, swirl the dregs of wine remaining in your kylix, and then with a flick of your wrist, fling these remnants at a target. The target varies. Sometimes it is a bronze disc balanced precariously on a stand in the center of the room. The goal is to strike it with enough force to knock it into a basin below, creating a satisfying clang. Other times, the game is played by attempting to sink small clay vessels floating in a larger bowl of water, using only the force of the wine dregs to capsize them. Still other variations involve trying to form a specific letter on the waterproofed floor. Traditionally, the first letter of one's beloved's name. As each participant takes his turn, he calls out a dedication. To the health of my beloved Alcibiades. One man shouts and sends his wine dregs arcing through the air. The accuracy of his throw is believed to augur well for his romantic prospects, and a successful strike is greeted with approving cheers. The floor, as the game progresses, becomes increasingly splattered with wine, justifying the waterproofed construction. By the end of the evening, it will be quite thoroughly soaked, and the slaves will face considerable labor in cleaning it. The prizes for winning at kotabos are modest, perhaps a sweet cake, perhaps something more intimate depending on the company present. And indeed, the company this evening includes not only the male citizens reclining on their couches, but also several hetairai, the courtesans of ancient Athens. These women occupy a unique social position. They are not the respectable wives and daughters of citizens, who are confined to the women's quarters of the home and would never be present at such a gathering. Elite women, properly married and devoted to managing the household and raising legitimate children, are excluded from this masculine world of intellectual exchange and sensual pleasure. The hetairai, by contrast, are educated and cultured, trained in music and conversation, as well as in the arts of physical intimacy. They recline on the couches alongside the men, participate in the games, and provide both intellectual companionship and erotic entertainment. Some of these women are quite famous, renowned for their beauty and wit, sought after by the wealthiest and most powerful men in Athens. Their presence tonight adds another dimension to the symposium, another layer of refinement and indulgence. They play kotabos with skill, their laughter mingling with the men's, their conversation sharp and engaging. As the evening progresses and more wine flows from the crater, the entertainment becomes more elaborate. One of the hetairai rises and begins to dance, her movements fluid and suggestive, accompanied by the quickening tempo of the flute. The men watch with appreciation, occasionally calling out encouragement. This is part of the expected entertainment, another element of the sensory pleasure that defines the symposium. But there are other pleasures to be had here beyond the merely physical. A guest suggests they recite poetry, and again the proposal is enthusiastically received. In ancient Greece, the ability to recall and perform verses from Homer or Hesiod, to improvise drinking songs, is a mark of education and culture. The symposium is, among other things, a competitive space where men demonstrate their sophistication and claim status within their peer group. Someone begins a scholion, a drinking song, singing the first verse in a clear, wine-warmed voice. The form is traditional. One participant begins, and another must improvise a continuation, matching the meter and tone while adding new content. The songs are often bawdy, celebrating wine, love, and the pleasures of the moment. They are also a test of wit and poetic skill, and a successful improvisation earns respect from the assembled company. The conversation, too, grows more philosophical as the night deepens. Someone raises a question about the nature of virtue, and suddenly the room is engaged in earnest debate. In the world of the elite Athenian male, philosophical inquiry is not an abstract academic pursuit, but a vital part of social life. You are expected to have opinions on ethics, on politics, on the nature of the gods and the cosmos. Perhaps someone mentions Socrates, that peculiar figure who haunts the agora, questioning assumptions and probing definitions with his relentless dialectical method. Or perhaps the discussion turns to the theories of Pythagoras or Heraclitus. The Symposium, at its best, is a space where wine loosens tongues and allows for genuine intellectual exploration, where the boundaries between philosophy and pleasure blur in the flickering lamplight. Of course, not all symposia reach these philosophical heights. As the wine continues to flow, and the symposiarch perhaps loosens the ratio, allowing stronger mixtures, inhibitions fade and behavior becomes less restrained. The line between civilized drinking and simple intoxication is crossed with increasing frequency as the night progresses. The vase paintings that survive from this period offer glimpses of symposia in various stages. Some depict orderly gatherings with men engaged in dignified conversation. Others show scenes of considerable abandoned men vomiting into bowls held by patient slaves, couples engaged in intimate acts, dancers in various states of undress. Sexual activity with both the hetairai and with the young male slaves and guests is a common feature of the later stages of symposia, depicted with surprising frankness on the pottery that adorned these very rooms. This is not considered scandalous by those present. Ancient Greek attitudes towards sexuality differ markedly from later moral frameworks. Men engage in romantic and sexual relationships with both women and men, and the Symposium is a space where such encounters are facilitated and even expected. The key distinction is not the gender of one's partner, but the roles assumed and the social status involved. As you recline on your cline, cup in hand, you are participating in a ritual that reinforces aristocratic male bonds and values. The Symposium is, fundamentally, about creating and maintaining social networks among the elite. The men gathered here tonight are your political allies, your business partners, your rivals for status and influence. The shared experience of drinking together, of demonstrating cultural sophistication, of indulging in pleasures forbidden to outsiders, binds you into a cohesive social class. Women, respectable women, at least are excluded. Slaves serve but do not participate as equals. The poor, those who must work for their living, have neither the leisure nor the resources for such gatherings. The Symposium is a deliberately exclusive institution, one that marks boundaries and reinforces hierarchies, even as it celebrates a certain democratic spirit among those permitted to recline on its couches. The symposiarch calls for another round, and the slave boys move to refill the cups from the crater. The wine is perhaps stronger now, the water ratio shifted to increase potency. Someone proposes another game of kotabos, and once more the wine dregs fly through the air, spattering against targets and floor alike. Laughter echoes off the painted walls. The flute player continues her melody, weaving a sonic tapestry that underlies every conversation, every jest, every philosophical tangent. Hours pass in this manner. The rhythm of the Symposium is unhurried, expansive. There is no pressure to conclude, no appointments demanding attention. This is time set aside purely for pleasure and for the cultivation of social bonds, and the wealthy men of Athens guard it jealously. Outside these walls, the city sleeps. Inside, the Symposium continues its measured progress through stages of conviviality, intellectual engagement, and sensual indulgence. As dawn approaches, the gathering finally begins to wind down. Some guests have already departed, helped to their feet by slaves, and guided homeward through darkened streets. Others have succumbed to the wine entirely, and lie sleeping on their couches to be roused when the household awakens. The hetairai gather their things, their evening's work complete, the promised payments already received, or to be settled on another day. You rise from your recline, your head pleasantly clouded with wine, your mind full of the evening's conversations and entertainments. The slave who brought your sandals earlier now helps you with your cloak. You step out into the cool pre-dawn air, the stars still visible above the rooftops of Athens, and make your way homeward through streets that will soon bustle with commerce and civic life, but which, for now, remain quiet and empty. The symposium is concluded. It was a night like countless others, a ritual repeated throughout the Greek world wherever men of means and culture gather to drink together. It reinforced your bonds with your peers, demonstrated your cultural sophistication, and provided a respite from the demands of public life. And perhaps, in its best moments, it offered genuine philosophical insight, a glimpse of truth revealed through the dialectical exchange that wine and friendship make possible. This is the world of the Greek symposium, simultaneously refined and indulgent, intellectual and sensual, exclusive and communal. It is a world governed by rituals that seem both familiar and utterly foreign, a world where democracy flourishes among citizens, while vast categories of humanity remain permanently excluded from its privileges. As the sky lightens and the first merchants begin to set up their stalls in the agora, the symposium fades into memory. One more evening in the intricate social fabric of ancient Athens. One more night in the rhythm of lives shaped by customs and expectations, vastly different from our own. The symposia continue, season after season, in the comfortable homes of Athens' elite. But the rhythm of these leisured gatherings is about to be disrupted by an external threat that will test the very survival of the city and its democratic institutions. It is the late summer of 490 BCE word reaches Athens that a massive Persian fleet has crossed the Aegean Sea and is approaching the coast of Attica. The ships number in the hundreds, carrying perhaps 15,000 infantry and cavalry, along with siege equipment and supplies for a prolonged campaign. This is the expeditionary force of Darius I, the great king of Persia, and its purpose is unambiguous: the subjugation of Athens and the punishment of the Greek city-states that have dared to support rebellions against Persian authority. The Persians are guided by Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens, expelled 2 decades earlier when the democracy was established. He seeks restoration to power under Persian sponsorship, and he has advised the invaders to land at Marathon, a coastal plain approximately 26 miles northeast of Athens, where the terrain favors the deployment of cavalry. It is a strategic choice, and as the Persian ships beach on the sandy shore and the troops begin to disembark, the threat becomes immediate and undeniable. In Athens, the assembly convenes an emergency session. The debate is urgent and divisive. Some argue for remaining behind the city walls, enduring a siege, and hoping that the fortifications will hold until Persian supplies run low or reinforcements arrive from Sparta. Others, led by the general Miltiades, advocate a bolder course. March out immediately and confront the Persians at Marathon before they can advance on the city. Miltiades is a seasoned commander who has previously lived under Persian rule and understands their military methods. He argues that the Athenian hoplites, the heavily armored citizen soldiers who form the backbone of the Greek military system, can defeat the Persian infantry if they engage on favorable terms. His confidence is not universally shared, but ultimately his counsel prevails. The decision is made. Athens will march to Marathon. Messengers are dispatched to Sparta, the preeminent military power of Greece, requesting immediate assistance. The runner chosen for this mission is Pheidippes, a professional courier known for his extraordinary endurance. He departs Athens at once, covering the approximately 140 miles to Sparta in just 2 days, running through mountain passes and across difficult terrain with remarkable speed. The Spartans receive him courteously and promise to send aid, but they are constrained by religious law. They are in the midst of a sacred festival and cannot march until the full moon. It will be days before their army can depart. Phidippides runs back to Athens with this disappointing news. The Athenians will have to face the Persians largely on their own, though the neighboring city of Plataea, honoring its alliance, sends a contingent of about 1,000 hoplites to join the Athenian force. Together, the Greek army numbers perhaps 11,000 men, 10,000 Athenians, and 1,000 Plataeans. The Athenian hoplites march out from the city in their tribal regiments, each man carrying his own armor and weapons. The panoply of the hoplite is substantial: a bronze helmet with cheek guards, a cuirass of bronze or reinforced linen protecting the torso, bronze greaves covering the shins, a large round shield called a hoplon on the left arm, a spear perhaps 8 feet long, and a short sword as a secondary weapon. The total weight of this equipment is considerable, and marching in it under the Mediterranean sun is exhausting work. They reach Marathon and establish their position on higher ground overlooking the plain where the Persian camp has been set up. For several days, the two armies face each other without engaging. The Athenian commanders are divided in their opinions. Some advocate waiting for the Spartans. Miltiades, however, continues to press for immediate action. He knows that delay favors the Persians, who might either advance on undefeated Athens or receive reinforcements from their fleet. The stalemate is broken by intelligence that changes the tactical situation dramatically. Observers report that the Persian cavalry, a significant portion of their force, and the element most feared by the Greek commanders, has temporarily left the camp. The reason for their absence is uncertain perhaps. They have been embarked on ships for a flanking maneuver. Perhaps they are foraging elsewhere. Regardless, their absence creates an opportunity that Miltiades seizes immediately. He convinces Callimachus, the war archon and nominal commander of the Athenian forces, to order a general attack. The decision is made. The Athenian line forms up on the morning of the battle. The hoplites arrange themselves in the traditional phalanx formation, a dense block of armored men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. But Miltiades makes a critical tactical adjustment to the standard deployment. He thins the center of his line to just 4 ranks deep, while maintaining the wings at the standard depth of 8 ranks. This creates a Greek line that matches the length of the Persian formation, preventing the Greeks from being outflanked, while concentrating strength on the wings. Whether this thinning of the center is a deliberate tactical innovation, a planned double envelopment, or simply a practical necessity to avoid being outflanked by the more numerous Persians is debated by later historians. Perhaps Miltiades indeed envisions the maneuver that will unfold, or perhaps he simply makes the best deployment available to him with the forces at hand. In either case, the arrangement will prove decisive. The order to advance is given. The phalanx begins to move forward across the plain toward the Persian lines. At first, the pace is measured, maintaining the cohesion essential to the phalanx formation. But as the distance closes and the Greek troops come within range of Persian archers, the Athenians break into a run. Herodotus, writing decades later, claims they ran the entire distance of 8 stadia, nearly a mile. Modern scholars consider this unlikely under the weight of armor and equipment. More probably, they advanced at a steady walk for most of the distance and only charged at a run for the final few hundred yards, reducing the time spent under arrow fire. The sight of the Greek charge is apparently shocking to the Persians, who have never before seen infantry advance at such speed. Herodotus reports that they considered the Greeks mad. The lines collide with tremendous force. The hoplites, with their heavy armor and long spears, have an advantage in close combat over the more lightly equipped Persian infantry. But the center of the Greek line, thinned to 4 ranks, begins to give ground under the pressure of the elite Persian and Saka troops positioned in the enemy center. The Athenian center retreats, bending backward. On the wings, however, the deeper Greek formations drive into the Persian flanks with overwhelming force. The Persian troops opposing the Greek wings are lighter troops, less capable in hand-to-hand combat against armored hoplites. They break and flee. And now, whether by design or fortunate circumstance, the critical moment of the battle arrives. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Persians on the wings, the victorious Greek flanks wheel inward. They converge on the Persian center, which is still engaged with the retreating Athenian center. The elite Persian troops, who moments before were pushing forward victoriously, suddenly find themselves attacked from three sides simultaneously. The double envelopment is complete. The Persian center, surrounded and under assault from front and both flanks, disintegrates. Cohesion breaks down. Panic spreads. The retreat becomes a rout. The Persians flee toward their ships beached on the shore. The Greeks pursue, and the killing is extensive. Many Persians are cut down as they run. Others, attempting to flee across the marshy ground at the edges of the plain, become trapped in the mud and are slaughtered or drowned. The fighting extends to the ships themselves, where desperate Persians attempt to launch vessels, while Greek hoplites wade into the surf to prevent their escape. The battle ends with a complete Greek victory. According to Herodotus, whose account is the primary ancient source, the Persians suffer catastrophic losses. 6,400 dead counted on the battlefield and in the marshes. The Greek casualties, by contrast, are astonishingly light: 192 Athenians and 11 Plataeans. Among the Athenian dead is Callimachus, the war archon who ordered the charge, struck down in the fighting. His death in battle will be honored in Athenian memory. The Greeks capture 7 Persian ships, though the bulk of the fleet manages to escape. The Persian commanders, realizing the land battle is lost, embark their remaining troops and sail around Cape Sunion, attempting to reach Athens before the Greek army can return. If the city is undefended, they might still seize it despite the defeat at Marathon. But Miltiades anticipates this maneuver. Immediately after the battle, without pausing to rest, he orders the Athenian army to march back to Athens. The hoplites, exhausted from battle and still wearing their armor, cover the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens in a forced march, arriving just as the Persian fleet appears offshore. Seeing the city defended and the victorious Greek army arrayed along the shore, the Persians realize that further attack is futile. They turn their ships and sail back across the Aegean toward Asia Minor. The threat is ended, at least for now. It is in connection with this return march that legend places the famous run of Phidippides, though the historical details are unclear and contradictory. Later traditions, popularized in the 19th century, claim that a messenger ran from the battlefield at Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, gasping, "We have won," before collapsing dead from exhaustion. The historical Phidippides, however, had made his epic run to Sparta before the battle. Whether he also ran from Marathon to Athens after the fighting, or whether this is a confusion of separate events, or whether the story is entirely legendary, cannot be determined with certainty. What is clear is that the distance from Marathon to Athens, approximately 26 miles, will eventually give its name to the modern athletic event that commemorates this ancient victory. The Spartans, true to their word, march north as soon as their religious festival permits. They arrive at Marathon after the battle has concluded and the Persians have departed. They tour the battlefield, examining the Persian dead and praising the Athenian achievement before returning home. For years afterward, Athenians will remind the Spartans, sometimes pointedly, that Athens alone faced the Persian threat at Marathon while Sparta delayed. The Athenian dead are given exceptional honor. Rather than being cremated and their ashes returned to the city, as is customary, they are buried on the battlefield itself, beneath a large earthen mound that is raised over their remains. This tumulus, the Choros, still stands today, a permanent monument to the men who fell defending their city. It is an unusual honor, reflecting the extraordinary significance of the victory. For Athens, Marathon becomes a defining moment in the city's identity. The victory demonstrates that Greek hoplites can defeat Persian armies, that citizen soldiers fighting for their freedom can overcome the professional troops of an empire. It emboldens Greek resistance and ensures that when the Persians return 10 years later under Xerxes with an even larger invasion force, the Greek cities will unite to oppose them rather than submitting without resistance. The battle also elevates Athens' status within the Greek world. Previously, Athens was important but not dominant among Greek cities. After Marathon, Athenian prestige soars. The men who fought there become revered as the Marathon fighters, celebrated in poetry and honored in public ceremony. Their achievement is invoked for generations as proof of Athenian courage and the superiority of democratic citizens over subjects of tyranny. Miltiades, the architect of the victory, enjoys brief glory before his career ends in disgrace and imprisonment following a failed expedition to Paros. But his tactical achievement at Marathon secures his place in history. The double envelopment maneuver, whether intentionally planned or fortunately improvised, demonstrates a level of tactical sophistication that influences Greek military thinking for generations. Later battles will see similar attempts to replicate the success of the Marathon wings. As night falls over the battlefield, the exhausted Athenian soldiers make camp among the fallen. The ground is soaked with blood. A smell of death hangs heavy in the air. Bodies lie scattered across the plain, mostly Persian, but including the honored Athenian dead who will be interred beneath the mound. The marshes at the edges of the plain hold their own grim harvest, where men fled and fell and drowned in their desperation to escape. For the survivors, the experience of battle has been horrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The phalanx combat is intimate and brutal, men pushing against each other shield to shield, stabbing with spears at any exposed flesh, the smell of sweat and blood, the screams of the wounded. When the Persians broke and ran, the Greeks pursued with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for the survival of their city and their way of life. The victory is complete, but it is won at the cost of witnessing scenes that will haunt many of the participants for the rest of their lives. The battlefield is a horrifying tableau of fallen men, a demonstration of what warfare demands of those who wage it. And yet, for all its grimness, Marathon represents something profoundly important in the Greek imagination: the triumph of the free citizen over the subject of despotic power, the vindication of the democratic experiment that Athens has undertaken. The men who fought there did so not as conscripts or mercenaries, but as citizens defending their own city, their own families, their own political autonomy. As dawn breaks over the plain the following morning, the work of burial and commemoration begins. The Greek dead are honored, the Persian dead are left for mass burial, and the Athenian army prepares for its forced march back to the city, racing against the Persian fleet, determined to defend their home to the last. Marathon is over, but its significance has only begun to unfold. It will inspire Greek resistance for generations, embolden Athens' rise to preeminence, and become one of history's most celebrated military engagements. And in the quiet darkness of countless future symposia, Athenian men will recline on their couches and speak with pride of the day their city stood alone against an empire and prevailed. The victory at Marathon secures Athens for another generation, but the world of ancient Greece extends far beyond the battlefield. In quieter, more mysterious ways, the Greeks seek knowledge of the future and the will of the gods. And there is no place more revered for such knowledge than Delphi, home to the most famous oracle of the ancient world. Delphi lies on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, about 80 miles northwest of Athens, in a landscape of dramatic natural beauty. Steep cliffs rise behind the sanctuary, and the ground falls away sharply into the valley below, offering sweeping views across the olive groves and mountains of central Greece. The site feels remote, elevated, touched by divine presence. Here, within the temple of Apollo, the god speaks through his chosen intermediary, the Pythia. She is a woman selected from among the local population, initially always a young virgin, though later, following an unfortunate incident involving the assault of a young Pythia, the role is filled by women over 50 who dress in the garments of a maiden. She serves for life, and there are periods when multiple Pythia serve in rotation to handle the volume of consultations. Imagine yourself as a visitor to Delphi, come to consult the oracle on a matter of great importance. Perhaps you represent your city, seeking guidance on whether to undertake a military campaign, establish a colony, or reform your laws. Or perhaps you are a wealthy individual seeking advice on a personal matter. Whatever your question, you have undertaken the journey to this sacred place because throughout the Greek world, the oracle's authority is unquestioned. The sanctuary is crowded with monuments and treasuries, buildings constructed by various Greek cities to house their offerings to Apollo and to compete in displays of wealth and piety. You pass among them, climbing the sacred way that winds upward through the sanctuary toward the temple of Apollo itself. Other pilgrims walk alongside you, some from distant lands, speaking languages you do not understand. The temple that dominates the sanctuary has been rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. An earlier structure burned in 548 BCE, and the current building, reconstructed around 510 BCE by the Alcmaeonid family of Athens with funds gathered from across Greece, stands as testament to the oracle's importance. It is a Doric structure with 6 columns across the front and 15 along each side, imposing in its proportions. Later, in 373 E, an earthquake will destroy this temple too, and it will be rebuilt once more, testament to the enduring significance of this place. As you approach, you see inscriptions carved into the temple walls. The famous Delphic maxims, "Know thyself, and nothing in excess." These injunctions to self-awareness and moderation reflect the philosophical sophistication that the oracle represents. But you have not come for philosophy. You have come for prophecy. Consultation of the oracle follows strict procedures and occurs only on specific days. In the earliest periods, the Pythia prophesies only once a year, on Apollo's birthday. Later, as demand increases, consultations are held once a month during the 9 months when Apollo is believed to reside at Delphi, the god spending the winter months elsewhere. You have timed your journey to coincide with one of these appointed days. There are fees to be paid and sacrifices to be performed. A preliminary sacrifice determines whether the day is auspicious for consultation. An animal, typically a goat, is brought forward and water is sprinkled upon it. If the animal trembles in a prescribed manner, the omens are favorable and consultations may proceed. If not, the day is inauspicious and the oracle will not speak. The Pythia herself undergoes ritual preparations. Ancient sources describe her bathing in the Castalian spring, a sacred water source near the sanctuary, to purify herself. She drinks from another spring, the Casodus, whose waters are believed to inspire prophetic ability. She chews laurel leaves, the plant sacred to Apollo, though whether this has any psychoactive effect is uncertain. Then she enters the inner sanctum of the temple, the Adyton, a restricted area where the actual prophecies are delivered. You, as a consultant, are not permitted to enter this space. Exactly what occurs within the Adyton has been a subject of speculation for millennia. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century CE, describe the Pythia sitting on a tripod positioned over a chasm in the earth, from which vapors rise. These vapors, according to Plutarch and others, induce the trance state in which she receives Apollo's messages. Under their influence, the Pythia enters an altered state of consciousness, sometimes appearing intoxicated or frenzied, and delivers pronouncements that the priests attending her must interpret and convey to the consultants waiting outside. For centuries, this account was dismissed by modern scholars as mythological. Early archaeological excavations of Delphi in the late 19th and early 20th centuries found no evidence of a chasm beneath the temple and no geological explanation for prophetic vapors. The rational consensus became that the oracle's pronouncements were either fabrications by the priests or the result of the Pythia's own intuition, and political awareness, with no supernatural or geological component. But in recent decades, this skepticism has been challenged by new scientific investigations that suggest the ancient sources may have been more accurate than previously believed. In 2001, a team led by geologist Gilles de Boer of Wesleyan University published findings that revived the geological explanation for the Pythias trance. De Boer and his colleagues identified two geological faults that intersect directly beneath the Temple of Apollo. These faults are relatively young and active, and at their intersection, they create pathways through which gases from deep in the earth could rise to the surface. The researchers analyzed spring water from the site and found traces of ethylene, along with methane and ethane, gases produced when bituminous limestone deep underground is heated. Ethylene is particularly interesting because it has known psychoactive properties. It was used as an anesthetic in the 19th and early 20th centuries before being replaced by safer alternatives. At low concentrations, ethylene produces a sense of euphoria, disembodiment, and heightened suggestibility effects, strikingly similar to the trance states described in ancient accounts of the Pythia. The geology of the site supports this scenario. The temple sits on bituminous limestone layers that could generate hydrocarbon gases, and the faults provide natural conduits for those gases to reach the surface. In the enclosed space of the Adyton, with the Pythia seated over the point where gases emerge, concentrations could build to levels sufficient to induce altered consciousness. Not all scholars accept this explanation. Some argue that the concentrations of ethylene would be insufficient, or that other gases like methane, carbon dioxide, or hydrogen sulfide might be responsible, or that no geological explanation is necessary, and the trance states were theatrical performances or psychological phenomena. The debate continues, but the geological evidence has made it impossible to simply dismiss the ancient accounts as superstition. Whether induced by geological gases, by psychological expectation, by political theater, or by some combination of all these factors, the Pythia's pronouncements wielded enormous influence across the Greek world. Consider the famous consultation by Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia in Asia Minor, around 550 BCE. Before trusting the oracle with an important question, Croesus tested multiple oracles, including Delphi, by sending messengers on the same day to ask what he was doing at that precise moment. According to the story, only Delphi answered correctly. He was boiling a lamb and a tortoise together in a bronze cauldron. Satisfied by this demonstration of prophetic power, Croesus then asked whether he should make war on the Persians. The oracle responded that if he made war on the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, interpreting this as a promise of victory, attacked Persia and was utterly defeated, losing his own kingdom to Cyrus the Great. The great empire destroyed, it turned out, was his own. The oracle's response was technically accurate but fatally ambiguous. This story, preserved in Herodotus, exemplifies the popular conception of Delphic prophecies as deliberately cryptic, interpretable in multiple ways, ensuring the oracle could never be proven wrong. And certainly, many of the famous prophecies that have survived are conveniently ambiguous, or were likely composed after the events they supposedly predicted. But modern scholarship suggests this reputation for ambiguity may be somewhat misleading. The prophecies we hear about in popular stories, dramatic predictions preserved by historians like Herodotus, are likely not representative of the typical oracular consultation. Records contemporary to actual consultations, inscriptions, and official documents present a different picture. Most real oracle responses appear to have been straightforward, practical, and unambiguous. Yes or no, do this or do that. They did not include conditional clauses like if you do X. They did not predict the future in elaborate verse. The famous ambiguous prophecies, the poetic riddles, were likely literary creations, stories told and retold, embellished in the retelling, composed after the fact to explain events that had already occurred. The actual business of the oracle was probably more prosaic, providing religious sanction for decisions already contemplated, offering advice on cult practices and religious matters, and giving authoritative answers to questions of protocol. Still, some prophecies did address momentous historical events and were remembered for their significance. When Athens faced the Second Persian invasion in 480 BCE, the city sent envoys to Delphi seeking guidance. The first response was bleak, advising the Athenians to flee to the ends of the earth because their city would be destroyed by fire and war. The delegation, devastated, sought a second consultation. This time, the oracle spoke of a wooden wall that would remain unconquered and mentioned divine Salamis, which would bring death to women's sons. The Athenian envoys returned with this cryptic pronouncement, and the assembly debated its meaning. Some interpreted the wooden wall as the old palisade on the Acropolis and advocated defending the citadel. Others, including the politician Themistocles, argued that the wooden wall referred to ships and that Athens should evacuate the population and trust in naval battle. Themistocles' interpretation prevailed. Athens was evacuated, the population sent to Salamis and other safe locations, and when the Persian army arrived, they found the city largely empty. The Persians burned Athens, but the people survived, and at the Battle of Salamis, fought in the narrow waters between the mainland and the island, the Athenian fleet and its allies destroyed the Persian navy in one of the most decisive naval engagements in ancient history. The wooden wall was vindicated, the oracle's wisdom confirmed, and Delphi's reputation never stood higher. Whether the prophecy was genuinely predictive, or whether it was vague enough to be reinterpreted to fit the outcome, or whether it was composed or modified after the fact to reflect what had actually happened, the effect was the same. The oracle's authority was enhanced. For the individual consultant waiting outside the Adyton, hoping for guidance, the experience of consulting the oracle carries profound psychological weight. You have traveled far, paid substantial fees, performed the required sacrifices, and waited your turn among pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The setting itself, the dramatic landscape, the crowded sanctuary, the imposing temple creates an atmosphere of sacred significance. When you are finally permitted to enter the temple and approach the Adyton, you present your question to the priests. You cannot see the Pythia directly. She remains in the inner chamber. You wait, aware that in that hidden space, the priestess sits on her tripod, perhaps breathing strange vapors, rising from the earth, perhaps entering a trance, perhaps channeling the voice of Apollo himself. When the response comes, delivered by the attending priests, it carries the weight of divine authority. Whether it is a simple yes or no, or a more elaborate instruction, you accept it as truth. You make the promised offerings, leave gifts for the temple, and depart, your question answered by the god. The oracle continues to function for nearly 1,000 years, from at least the 8th century BCE until the 4th century CE, when the rise of Christianity and the suppression of pagan religious practices bring an end to its consultations. Over those centuries, it shapes Greek history in countless ways, lending religious authority to colonization efforts, political decisions, military campaigns, and cultural practices. The physical site falls into ruin and obscurity. The Temple of Apollo, destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over its history, eventually collapses. The sanctuary is buried by rock slides and by the slow accumulation of centuries. The modern town of Delphi is built atop and around the ancient ruins. Excavations beginning in the late 19th century reveal the extent of the ancient sanctuary, uncovering the treasuries, the theater, the stadium, and the foundations of the temple. The work continues to this day, as archaeologists piece together the physical reality of this place that once held such spiritual significance. The Castalian spring still flows, though now much of its water is diverted for the modern town's use. Traces of ethylene and other hydrocarbons can be detected in the groundwater, offering tantalizing evidence for the geological theory of the Pythia's trance. The two fault lines still run beneath the temple site, still active, still potentially releasing gases from the bituminous limestone below. Standing among the ruins today, one can imagine the pilgrims who climbed the sacred way, the consultants who waited anxiously for the god's response, the Pythia herself seated on her tripod in the enclosed adyton, breathing vapors that may have been geologically real, or may have been legendary, delivering pronouncements that shaped the course of Greek history. The mystery of Delphi, the question of how and why the oracle worked, whether its power derived from divine inspiration, geological accident, political manipulation, psychological suggestion, or some combination of all these factors, remains not entirely resolved, and perhaps that is appropriate. The oracle always spoke in ways that required interpretation, that left space for human agency even as it claimed divine authority. As you descend from the sanctuary, leaving the temple behind, the oracle's words accompany you. They will shape your decisions, influence your city's policies, perhaps determine the course of your life. Whether the Pythia truly channeled the voice of Apollo, or whether she performed a role shaped by geology, psychology, and political necessity, the effect is the same. You have consulted the oracle, and the god has spoken. The shadows lengthen across the slopes of Parnassus. The pilgrims disperse, each carrying away their answers, their doubts, their interpretations. The Pythia, her duties concluded for the day, emerges from the adyton, the vapors dissipating, the trance fading, returning to ordinary consciousness and ordinary life until the next appointed day when Apollo's voice will be needed once more. Delphi endures in memory as the place where mortals sought communion with the divine, where the future seemed knowable, where the earth itself whispered secrets through fissures in the rock. Whether those secrets were genuine prophecy or artful ambiguity, geological phenomenon or theatrical performance, they shaped a civilization, an echo still in the ruins that cling to the mountainside, silent now, but bearing witness to centuries of questions asked and answers given. We leave the mysteries of Delphi and return to Athens, but to an Athens transformed from the city that marched to Marathon. It is now the 440s BCE, the height of what later generations will call the Golden Age, the Age of Pericles. The Persian threat, though never entirely forgotten, has receded. Athens has emerged from the wars not merely victorious, but dominant, the leading power of a vast maritime alliance that has evolved into an empire. And the wealth flowing into the city from tribute paid by allied states is transforming Athens into the cultural and intellectual center of the Greek world. Imagine yourself walking through this city on an ordinary morning in, say, 445 BCE. The sun is already warm, promising another hot Mediterranean day. You make your way toward the Agora, the marketplace and civic center that forms the beating heart of Athenian life. The Agora is a large open space surrounded by public buildings, colonnaded stoas, and temples. As you approach, the noise level rises the sound of hundreds of voices engaged in commerce, debate, gossip, and argument. This is where Athens conducts its daily business, where citizens gather to discuss politics and philosophy, where goods from across the Mediterranean are bought and sold, where friendships are forged and reputations are made or destroyed. The marketplace itself is crowded with temporary stalls and permanent shops. Vendors call out their wares, competing for attention. You pass a bread seller offering fresh loaves, the smell warm and yeasty. Nearby, a fruit vendor displays figs, grapes, and pomegranates arranged in appealing pyramids. A fishmonger has laid out his morning catch red mullet, octopus eels prized for their flavor on a stone counter, the smell pungent and briny. The range of goods available is remarkable, a testament to Athens' maritime empire and trading networks. Beyond the basic necessities, there are luxury items from distant lands. Ivory from Africa, spices from Asia, amber from the far north, fine textiles dyed with expensive purple. Perfume sellers offer scents from Arabia and Egypt. Slave traders conduct their business in designated areas, displaying human beings for purchase as casually as others sell pottery or wine. For indeed, slavery is fundamental to this economy and society. Perhaps a quarter to a third of the population of Athens and its surrounding territory of Attica are enslaved. They work in households, in workshops, in the silver mines at Laurion, in agriculture. Some are treated relatively well, enjoying a degree of autonomy and even the possibility of eventually purchasing their freedom. Others endure brutal conditions, particularly those condemned to the mines. Their presence is ubiquitous and unremarkable to the free residents of Athens. Also present in the Agra are the metics, resident foreigners who live in Athens but are not citizens. They might be merchants, craftsmen, or intellectuals attracted to Athens' opportunities and culture. They pay a special tax for the privilege of residing in the city and are subject to military service, but they cannot own land or participate in political life. Yet the city depends on them for much of its commercial activity and skilled labor. The Agra is policed by officials who ensure fair weights and measures. Athenian shopkeepers have a reputation for cheating foreigners, and the metronomoi, the market inspectors, maintain official standards to which merchants can be held accountable. They operate from the tholos, a round building on the south side of the Agra. But the Agra is not merely a marketplace. It is also the civic center, surrounded by buildings that house the institutions of Athenian democracy. You see clusters of men engaged in animated political discussion, debating recent decisions of the assembly or speculating about foreign policy. This is where Socrates will wander in coming decades, engaging passers-by in his famous dialectical questioning. Though he is still a young man in the 440s, the democracy that governs this city is direct and participatory, at least for those who qualify as citizens. And the qualifications are strict and exclusive. To be a citizen, you must be male, over 18, and born to parents who are both Athenian citizens. This last requirement was formalized in a law passed by Pericles himself in 451 BCE, tightening the definition of citizenship and reducing the number of those eligible for the privileges it confers. If you are fortunate enough to be a citizen, you have the right and responsibility to participate in the governance of Athens. The assembly, the ecclesia, meets regularly on the Nix, a hill just west of the Acropolis. The space can accommodate about 6,000 men, and meetings are held at least once a month, often more frequently. Any citizen can attend, speak, and vote. Decisions are made by simple majority, determined by a show of hands. The assembly debates and decides on all major matters: war and peace, treaties, public expenditures, laws, appointments of officials. There is no representative government, no intermediary between the citizen and the decision. This is democracy in its most direct form, noisy, contentious, sometimes impulsive, but genuinely participatory for those included within the citizenry. Of course, that inclusiveness is sharply limited. Women are entirely excluded from political participation. They cannot vote, cannot speak in the assembly, cannot hold public office. Indeed, they are largely confined to the domestic sphere, managing households and raising children, but taking no part in public life. Respectable women rarely appear in public spaces like the Agra. When they do, their movements are restricted and supervised. Their names are not even spoken in public discourse. Orators avoid mentioning the wives and daughters of citizens by name, finding circumlocutions to refer to them when necessary. The irony is striking. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, extends political rights only to a fraction of its population. Adult male citizens constitute perhaps 15 to 20% of the total inhabitants when women, children, slaves, and metics are counted. The brilliant political culture that will influence Western civilization for millennia rests on a foundation of systematic exclusion. But for those included, the political culture is vibrant and demanding. As you linger in the Agra this morning, you might hear that the assembly is meeting today on the Nix. If you are a citizen, you are expected to attend. You make your way toward the hill, joining the flow of men heading in that direction. The Nix is a natural amphitheater, its slopes carved and terraced to provide seating. The speaker's platform, the bema, is positioned so the speaker faces the assembled citizens with the Acropolis visible behind him, a constant reminder of the city you are governing. As the meeting begins, the space fills with thousands of men, settling onto the stone benches, or standing if seats are unavailable. Today's agenda might include a debate about public expenditures for the ongoing building program on the Acropolis. For this is the decade when Athens is transforming its sacred citadel into a monumental showcase of marble and gold. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena, is under construction on the highest point of the Acropolis. Work began in 447 BCE, and by the 440s, the building is taking shape. The project is staggering in its ambition and expense. Approximately 100,000 tons of marble are being quarried from Mount Pentelicus, about 10 miles from Athens, and transported to the Acropolis. The logistics alone are extraordinary. The Parthenon is designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, but the overall supervision belongs to Phidias, Athens' greatest sculptor. The building will house a colossal chryselephantine statue of Athena made of gold and ivory that Phidias is creating for the interior. When completed and dedicated in 438 BCE, this statue will be one of the wonders of the Greek world, 40 feet tall, depicting the goddess in full armor, holding a winged victory in one hand and a shield in the other. The exterior of the temple is being adorned with elaborate sculptural decoration. The metopes, the rectangular panels above the columns, depict mythological scenes: gods battling giants, Greeks fighting Amazons, the Trojan War, the conflict between Lapiths and Centaurs. Around the top of the inner chamber runs the Ionic frieze, a continuous relief sculpture more than 500 feet long. This frieze is one of the most beautiful and mysterious elements of the Parthenon. It depicts a procession of horsemen, musicians, sacrifice attendants, elders, and gods. The most common interpretation, developed over centuries of scholarship, is that it represents the Panathenaic procession, the great festival held every 4 years to honor Athena on her birthday. The Panathenaea is one of the most important festivals in the Athenian calendar. It begins with an all-night celebration, the Panichus, featuring music, dancing, and torch races. At dawn, a new sacred fire is kindled and carried in relay from outside the city through the Agora to the altar on the Acropolis. Then comes the grand procession itself. Imagine witnessing this spectacle. The procession forms at the Dippolon Gate, where the sacred way enters the city. First come the cavalry, hundreds of young men on horseback, the city's elite, dressed in their finest. Then musicians playing pipes and lyres, their melodies accompanying the march. Animals for sacrifice, cattle, sheep, goats, are led along, garlanded and docile. Chariots roll past, occupants standing proudly. Elderly men carry olive branches, honored for their age and service to the city. Young women selected for the privilege bear ritual objects, water jugs, incense, libation vessels. At the center of the procession is the peplus, a new robe woven for the statue of Athena. This garment, created by Athenian women over the course of many months, is elaborately decorated with scenes from mythology. In earlier times, it was carried folded by young women, but in later years, it is displayed on the mast of a wheeled ship that is pulled through the streets. The entire city participates or watches. Even slaves are given a holiday. The procession winds through the Agora, climbs the sacred way to the Acropolis, and culminates at the altar of Athena, where the animals are sacrificed and the peplus is presented. It is a moment of civic unity, a celebration of Athenian identity and devotion to the goddess who protects their city. And this procession, frozen in marble relief, will encircle the Parthenon forever, visible to all who enter the temple. It is a statement of civic pride, a declaration that Athens has become the cultural and political center of the Greek world. worthy of monuments that rival any in existence. Of course, this building program is controversial. The funds come largely from the treasury of the Delian League, the alliance of Greek cities formed to resist Persian aggression. These funds, contributed by allied cities for mutual defense, are being spent by Athens on beautifying its own city. Some consider this misappropriation, even theft. But Pericles, the leading politician of the era, argues that Athens, as the leader of the alliance and primary defender of Greek freedom, deserves such monuments. The assembly agrees, and the construction continues. The completed Parthenon will stand as the most perfect expression of classical Greek architecture, Doric temple with subtle refinements that make it appear more graceful than mere geometry would allow. The columns lean slightly inward. The floor curves gently upward in the center. The corner columns are slightly thicker, all adjustments so subtle they're barely perceptible, but which give the building its harmonious, alive appearance. It will remain largely intact for over 2,000 years, suffering its worst damage only in the modern era. From the Pnyx, if you turn your gaze toward the Acropolis, you can see the construction in progress. Scaffolding surrounds the rising marble structure. The sounds of chisels on stone, of ropes and pulleys, of workers' shouts drift down to the assembly. It is a visible reminder of Athenian power and ambition. After the assembly concludes its business, you might make your way to the Theater of Dionysus, built into the southern slope of the Acropolis. In this space, carved from the hillside and fitted with wooden seats, the great dramatic festivals of Athens are performed. The city Dionysia, held each spring, is the most prestigious of these festivals. It lasts about 5 days and attracts visitors from across Greece. 3 tragic playwrights compete, each presenting a trilogy of tragedies and a satyr play. Comedies are also performed. The entire city attends, with the theater packed beyond its normal capacity, spectators sitting on the natural slopes beyond the constructed seating. In the 440s, you might witness premieres by Sophocles, who is at the height of his creative powers. Perhaps you see Antigone performed for the first time, that profound exploration of law, conscience, and the conflict between individual morality and state authority. The themes resonate with a democratic audience familiar with political debate and the tension between personal conviction and civic duty. Or perhaps you witness one of Euripides' innovative tragedies, with their psychological complexity and questioning of traditional values. The comic playwright Aristophanes will come later, in the final decades of the century, but comedy is already well established. Its crude humor and political satire offering counterpoint to the serious moral weight of tragedy. The performances begin at dawn and continue through the day. The actors wear masks and elaborate costumes. There is minimal scenery, just a stage building representing a palace or temple as needed. The plays rely on the power of language, on the beauty of verse, on the skill of the actors to create their dramatic effects. The audience is not passive. They react vocally to performances, cheering, hissing, applauding. Judges selected from among the citizens award prizes to the best productions, though their decisions are undoubtedly influenced by the crowd's response. The competition is fierce, the honor of victory significant. These dramatic festivals are not mere entertainment. They are civic and religious occasions, part of the festival honoring Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. They explore fundamental questions about justice, fate, human nature, the relationship between mortals and gods. They hold up mirrors to Athenian society, examining its values and sometimes critiquing its choices. As evening falls, you make your way back through the city. The Agra is quieter now, the market stalls being dismantled for the night. Shopkeepers close their workshops. The streets begin to empty as people return to their homes. If you are a woman of citizen family, you have spent the entire day in the domestic quarters of your home, managing servants, supervising children, weaving, attending to the countless tasks that keep a household functioning. You did not go to the Agra, did not attend the assembly? did not watch the plays. Your world is bounded by the walls of the house, and perhaps occasional visits to female neighbors, or participation in women's religious festivals. If you are a slave, your day has been spent in labor domestic service, workshop production, or if you are among the unfortunate condemned to the mines, brutal physical toil underground in conditions that frequently prove fatal. You have no freedom, no legal protection against your owner's whims, no prospect of political participation. At best, you might hope for kind treatment and eventual manumission. If you are a medic, you have contributed to the city's prosperity through your trade or craft, but you remain an outsider, permitted to reside, but never to fully belong. Only if you are an adult male citizen born to Athenian parents do you enjoy the full privileges of this democracy. Only then do you participate in the assembly, vote on war and peace, serve on juries, hold public office by lot, attend the symposia, watch the plays from seats of honor, walk the agora as a full member of the political community. This is the paradox at the heart of classical Athens. It creates the most participatory democracy of the ancient world while excluding the majority of its population from participation. It produces philosophy, drama, and art that will inspire Western civilization for millennia, funded by an empire and built by slave labor. It celebrates reason, debate, and civic virtue while denying women any public voice and treating slaves as property. And yet, for those included, the experience is extraordinary. Nowhere else in the world do ordinary citizens exercise such direct power over their government. Nowhere else is intellectual life so vibrant, artistic achievement so celebrated, individual excellence so rewarded. Athens in the 440s is a city at its zenith, confident in its power, rich in its resources, brilliant in its cultural production. The Parthenon rises on the Acropolis, its marble gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. The agora buzzes with commerce and debate. The assembly gathers on the Nix to decide the city's fate. The theater resounds with poetry that explores the deepest questions of human existence. And in private homes, symposia bring together educated men to drink wine, play games, and discuss philosophy. This is Periclean Athens flawed, exclusive, built on foundations we would now find morally unacceptable, yet undeniably magnificent in its achievements. A city that invented democracy while limiting it, that celebrated individual freedom while enslaving others, that produced timeless art and thought while denying basic rights to most of its population. As night settles over Athens, oil lamps flicker to life in windows. The stars emerge overhead, the same constellations observed by the ancient poets whose verses are recited at symposia. Somewhere in the city, perhaps in a comfortable andron, men are already reclining on couches, preparing for an evening of wine and conversation. On the Acropolis, the incomplete Parthenon stands in darkness, waiting for tomorrow's work to resume. This rhythm of life civic participation, cultural achievement, social ritual, all undergirded by exclusions and inequalities, will continue for another generation. But change is coming. The Peloponnesian War will begin in 431 BCE, bringing 3 decades of conflict that will drain Athens' resources, test its democratic institutions, and ultimately end its dominance. Plague will ravage the city in 430 BCE, killing perhaps a third of the population, including Pericles himself. But in the 440s, such disasters lie in the future, barely imaginable to the confident citizens who walk these streets. For now, Athens stands at the peak of its power and glory, a city that has defeated empires, created enduring art, and invented new forms of government. Its achievements will echo through history, inspiring and challenging every society that follows. Sleep comes to the city gradually, house by house, as the citizens who have spent the day in the agora, the assembly, and the theater settle into rest, ready to rise with the sun and begin again the endless round of commerce, politics, culture, and social life that defines this extraordinary place. Imagine yourself waking before dawn. The cabin around you is dark, barely more than a rough shelter with walls that let the wind through. The floor beneath you is packed dirt, cool in summer, freezing in winter. There's no furniture to speak of. Perhaps a crude wooden frame with corn husks serving as a mattress. You share this space with others, your family if you're fortunate enough to still have them together, though that fortune can change at any moment. The overseer's horn sounds, cutting through the pre-dawn stillness. It's time to rise. There's no lingering, no slow stretch into wakefulness. The day begins now, and it will not end until the sun has long since set. You step outside, the air still holding the coolness of night, though you know by midday it will be oppressive, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. You walk toward the fields, joining the silent procession of others. Some are family, some are neighbors in bondage, all are property. That's the legal reality that defines every aspect of your existence. You are chattel, owned as completely as a horse or a plow. Your body is not your own. Your time is not your own. Even your children, should you have any, belong to the man who owns you. The fields stretch before you, endless rows of cotton or tobacco or rice, depending on where this plantation lies. If this is the rice country of South Carolina or Georgia, you'll spend your days in swampy lowlands, standing in water that breeds mosquitoes and disease. The labor is backbreaking, bent over for hours, planting or weeding or harvesting under the supervision of men who carry whips. If this is cotton country, the work follows the seasons with relentless predictability. Spring means planting, summer means endless weeding and tending. Fall means picking until your fingers bleed from the sharp bowls. Each person is expected to pick a certain amount each day, perhaps 100 pounds or more, and falling short brings punishment. The cotton has to be clean, free of leaves and debris, and the pace has to be fast. Always fast. Time is money to those who own you. The work is organized around the gang system, a brutal efficiency that divides enslaved workers into groups. The strongest and healthiest are in the first gang, doing the hardest labor. The weaker, the older, the children are in subsequent gangs, given tasks slightly less demanding, but still exhausting. Even the very young have work to do, driving birds away from the crops, carrying water, picking up debris. From childhood to old age, there is no respite. The sun climbs higher, and with it comes the heat. By midday, especially in summer, the temperature can reach well over 100 degrees. You're standing in it, working in it, with no shade except perhaps the crops themselves. The sun beats down on your head, your back, your arms. Sweat soaks through the rough homespun clothing you wear, the same garments you've worn for months, because new clothes come only once or twice a year, if that. The overseer watches. He's a white man, hired by the plantation owner to extract maximum labor from human property. Some overseers are merely stern, others are cruel. The whip is always present, coiled at his belt or in his hand, a constant threat. Step out of line, work too slowly, show any hint of resistance, and you'll feel it. The lash cuts skin, leaves scars that mark your back for life. Sexual assault is another constant threat, particularly for enslaved women. The overseer, or the owner himself, or his sons, any white man can violate an enslaved woman with impunity. She is chattel, and chattel cannot be wronged in any legal sense, only trespassed upon as property. Around noon, there might be a brief break. You sit in whatever shade you can find, eating the meager rations provided. The food is barely sufficient to sustain the labor demanded of you. Cornmeal forms the basis of most meals, perhaps supplemented with a small amount of salt pork or salt fish. The meat is heavily preserved with salt, which leaves you constantly thirsty. There are no fresh vegetables, unless you've managed to grow a small garden near your cabin, in what little free time exists on Sunday. Milk is rare, fresh fruit almost unknown. The diet lacks essential vitamins and nutrients. though no one understands nutrition in those terms yet. They only know that children get sick, that bones become weak, that eyesight fails. The afternoon stretches on. Your hands move automatically now, the motions ingrained from years of this labor. Plant, hoe, pick, plant, hoe, pick. The repetition is almost meditative in its monotony, except that your back aches, your hands hurt, and the sun shows no mercy. If you're working rice, you're still standing in water, which has its own misery. The constant dampness, the insects, the way your legs develop painful sores from the prolonged exposure. Disease is a constant presence on the plantation. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in the slave quarters breed illness. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, these sweep through periodically, killing the weak and the young. Parasitic worms infest digestive systems. Tuberculosis lingers, a slow killer. Infants die at alarming rates, victims of tetanus from infections or simple malnutrition. The death rate among enslaved people is significantly higher than among the white population, a direct result of poor living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and brutal labor. As the sun finally begins to descend, the work continues. Sundown is not always the end. During harvest season, you might work into the darkness by moonlight or torchlight, desperate to bring in the crop before weather ruins it. But on a typical day, as twilight falls, the overseer finally signals that the day is done. You walk back to your cabin, exhausted beyond words. Evening brings its own routines. There's a small fire to build for cooking, if you have the energy and the fuel. More cornmeal, perhaps cooked into a mush or fried into cakes. You eat, and the food sits heavy in your stomach, filling but not nourishing. Around you, others do the same. Some whisper quietly, sharing small pieces of news or comfort. Families try to maintain bonds, despite the system designed to fracture them. That system of family separation is perhaps the cruelest aspect of slavery beyond the violence itself. At any moment, you might be sold. Your spouse might be sold. Your children, even infants, might be taken away, sold to another plantation, another state, never to be seen again. The auction block is a constant terror, the place where families are destroyed for profit. A plantation owner falls into debt, and human beings are liquidated to pay creditors. An owner dies, and the estate is divided, with enslaved people parceled out among heirs like furniture or livestock. You have no legal recourse, no protection under law. An enslaved person cannot testify against a white person in court, cannot own property, cannot enter into contracts, cannot marry legally, though many enslaved couples form unions and try to maintain them. These marriages have no legal standing, and they can be dissolved at any moment by sale. The law is clear. You are property, not a person. Resistance takes many forms, though open rebellion is rare and brutally suppressed. Small acts of defiance occur daily, working slowly when the overseer isn't watching, breaking tools accidentally, feigning illness. Some attempt escape, though the odds are overwhelmingly against success. The patrols, groups of white men authorized to stop and question any black person, make travel without a pass nearly impossible. Punishment for attempted escape is severe: whipping, branding, even maiming. Some enslaved people are fitted with iron collars with bells, making silent movement impossible. Others have their Achilles tendons cut, a permanent crippling meant to prevent future attempts. Winter brings a different kind of hardship. The thin clothing provided is insufficient against the cold. The cabin offers little warmth, its walls poorly chinked, its door ill-fitting. You shiver through the nights, huddled with others for warmth. The work continues, different tasks now: repairing equipment, building fences, clearing land. The cold makes everything harder. Hands become chapped and raw. Chilblains develop on fingers and toes. The psychological trauma of this existence is profound and permanent. You live with the knowledge that you are considered less than human by the society around you. The law defines you as property. The church, which many plantation owners attend faithfully, offers scriptural justifications for slavery. You are told, sometimes, that this is the natural order, that enslavement is your proper place. Some enslaved people find solace in religion, developing their own interpretations of Christianity that emphasize liberation and justice. Others find community and identity in African cultural traditions, maintained despite attempts to suppress them. Storytelling becomes a form of resistance and preservation. In the evenings, when the work is finally done, stories are told African folktales, stories of clever animals outwitting stronger predators, tales that carry coded messages about survival and resistance. Songs serve similar purposes, work songs that pace the labor but also carry deeper meanings, spirituals that speak of longing for freedom in both earthly and heavenly terms. These cultural practices are acts of humanity, assertions of personhood in a system designed to deny it. The bondage is hereditary. If you are born enslaved, your children will be born enslaved. The condition follows the mother, so the children of enslaved women are automatically enslaved regardless of the father's status. This creates a perpetual labor force that reproduces itself, and it means that any hope you might have for a better life cannot extend to future generations under the current system. Your grandchildren will face the same fields, the same whips, the same dehumanization. Some plantations are larger than others, some owners more or less cruel, but the fundamental dynamic remains constant. You are property, and your labor is extracted by force. A small farm owner struggling economically might provide even less food, even crueler treatment, desperate to squeeze every ounce of productivity from the few enslaved people he owns. A large plantation with hundreds of enslaved workers might have slightly more organized routines, but the scale of the operation means more overseers, more surveillance, less possibility of any small freedom. The tobacco plantations of Virginia and Maryland have their own rhythms, the careful tending of seedlings, the transplanting, the constant vigilance against pests, the harvest and curing process. The work is skilled in some ways, requiring knowledge passed down, but that skill is never recognized or rewarded. You are still property, and property doesn't receive wages or thanks. The cotton plantations of the Deep South represent perhaps the harshest conditions. The Cotton Kingdom, as it's called, runs on enslaved labor. By 1850, nearly 2 million enslaved people labor in the United States, and more than half of them work in cotton. The crop has made some plantation owners extraordinarily wealthy, and that wealth rests entirely on the backs of those who pick the cotton, process it, bale it, and prepare it for shipment to textile mills in New England and England. The gin, a building where cotton is processed, represents another form of danger. The machinery can catch clothing or fingers, causing injuries. The work is hot, dusty, and loud. Enslaved people with particular skills might work here, or in the blacksmith shop, or as carpenters, but skilled labor brings no improvement in legal status. A skilled artisan who is enslaved is still property, still subject to sale, still without rights. As you lie down at the end of another day, the dirt floor hard beneath you, the voices of others in the cabin a quiet murmur. Sleep comes from exhaustion rather than comfort. Tomorrow will be the same. The day after that will be the same. The seasons will change, the crops will rotate, but the fundamental reality of your existence remains. You are enslaved, and you will remain enslaved unless something fundamental changes in the world around you. Some enslaved people live their entire lives in a single plantation, knowing only one place, one set of fields, one master's face. Others are sold multiple times, moving from place to place, each sale a fresh trauma, each new location requiring adaptation to new rhythms, new cruelties, new co-workers in bondage. The domestic slave trade is extensive, with enslaved people moved from the Upper South to the Deep South as the Cotton Kingdom expands westward. Families are separated by hundreds of miles, with no hope of reunion. The quarters at night are a strange mixture of suffering and humanity. Despite everything, people form bonds, share what little they have, offer comfort when possible. Mothers sing to their children, trying to give them some small piece of normalcy. Couples whisper to each other, maintaining intimacy despite the lack of privacy. Elders share wisdom and stories, preserving knowledge and culture. These acts of connection are quiet rebellions against a system designed to reduce human beings to units of labor. The master's house sits on a hill, visible from the fields, a constant reminder of the hierarchy. It's built of the labor you and others provided, constructed by enslaved craftsmen, maintained by domestic enslaved workers. The white columns gleam in the sunlight, a symbol of wealth and power that rests entirely on the exploitation of human beings. You rarely see inside it, and when you do, it's always in the context of service-bringing firewood, carrying water, performing some task that brings you briefly into that world of comfort before sending you back to your cabin. Your entire existence is shaped by laws written to maintain slavery. The slave codes of various southern states specify in detail what enslaved people cannot do, cannot gather in groups, cannot learn to read or write, cannot own weapons, cannot leave the plantation without a written pass, cannot testify against white people, cannot defend themselves against white violence. These laws create a cage more powerful than any physical structure. And yet, resistance persists. The very fact that such extensive laws are needed reveals the constant effort required to maintain the system. Enslaved people do gather secretly, do learn to read despite the prohibitions, do find ways to maintain their humanity and dignity in the face of dehumanization. Some become literate through clandestine teaching by other enslaved people, or occasionally sympathetic whites. Some maintain African religious practices, alongside or instead of Christianity. Some plan escapes that, while rarely successful, represent assertions of the fundamental human desire for freedom. The threat of being sold down the river to the Deep South hangs over enslaved people in the Upper South. The phrase becomes synonymous with the worst possible fate, because conditions in the cotton plantations of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana are known to be particularly brutal. Life expectancy is lower, the work harder, the climate more oppressive. This threat is used as punishment and control behave, or face being sold away from everyone you know to an even worse situation. As another day ends, as your body finally stills in sleep, the knowledge remains embedded in your consciousness. This is not temporary. This is not something you can escape through hard work or good behavior. This is the structure of your world, maintained by laws, by violence, by an entire economic system that has made human bondage its foundation. The only escapes are death, the unlikely possibility of being freed by your owner, or the even more unlikely success of running away to free territory. The seasons cycle through. Spring planting, summer cultivating, fall harvesting, winter preparing for the next cycle. Years pass this way, each one much like the last. Children are born into slavery, learn to work as soon as they're able, grow to adulthood knowing nothing but the fields and the quarters, and the ever-present threat of violence. Some resist this knowledge, cling to hope, believe that change might come. Others fall into despair, the weight of permanent bondage crushing something essential in the spirit. And yet, humanity persists. Love exists in the quarters. Joy finds small expressions, in songs and stories, in the rare moments of rest. Resistance, even when it cannot overthrow the system, maintains dignity. The enslaved community creates its own culture, its own values, its own understanding of right and wrong that stands in opposition to the legal and social order imposed from above. This cultural resistance becomes a form of survival, a way to remain human in a system designed to reduce people to things. Your life as an enslaved field worker is one of unrelenting toil, inadequate sustenance, constant vulnerability to violence, and the psychological trauma of being legally defined as property. The work is exhausting, the conditions are degrading, and the bondage is permanent. You would not last a week in this environment without being fundamentally changed by the brutality of it, the dehumanization of it, the sheer grinding hardship of it. And for those who lived it, there was no week, no month, no year when it ended. For many, it lasted their entire lives, and their children's lives, and their grandchildren's lives. That is the true horror of chattel slavery. Not just its cruelty, but its permanence, its generational curse, its reduction of human beings to property. The world of the plantation, with its rhythms of forced labor and controlled existence, occasionally erupted into violence. Most resistance was small and individual, a broken tool, a feigned illness, a whispered act of defiance. But sometimes resistance took the form of open rebellion, and no slave uprising in American history would have a more profound impact than the one that began on a hot August night in Southampton County, Virginia. Nat Turner was born into slavery in 1800, the property of Benjamin Turner in Southampton County. From childhood, he was marked as different, intelligent, deeply religious, and according to those who knew him, possessed of an intensity that set him apart. He learned to read, an unusual accomplishment for an enslaved person in a society that increasingly prohibited slave literacy precisely because it feared educated slaves. His intelligence and his fervent Christianity earned him the role of preacher among the enslaved community, a position of respect and influence. But Turner's religious faith took a particular form. He experienced visions, moments when he believed God spoke to him directly, revealing divine plans and purposes. These visions were not unusual in the religious culture of the time. Both black and white Christians in the early 19th century often spoke of direct divine communication, dreams with meaning, signs from God. What made Turner's visions significant was the content and his interpretation of them. In the late 1820s, Turner's visions began to take on an explicitly revolutionary character. On May 12, 1828, he experienced what he would later describe as a crucial revelation. A spirit appeared to him and declared that the time was fast, approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. This biblical language, drawn from the Gospels, took on explosive meaning in the context of slavery. The first, the white masters, the plantation owners, those who held power, would become last. The last, the enslaved, the powerless, the oppressed, would become first. Turner understood this vision as a divine mandate for revolutionary action. He was not simply seeking personal freedom or even the liberation of a small group. He believed God had called him to lead a general uprising, a violent overthrow of the slavery system itself. But the vision also told him to wait for a sign, a clear indication that the time had come. So Turner waited, praying and preparing, sharing his visions with a small group of trusted fellow slaves. The sign came on February 12, 1831, when a solar eclipse darkened the sky over Southampton County. To Turner, this astronomical event was the signal he had been waiting for. The heavens themselves were announcing that the time of reckoning had arrived. He began to plan in earnest, confiding in a small circle of conspirators, men he trusted absolutely, fellow slaves who shared his desperation and his willingness to risk everything for freedom. Through the spring and summer of 1831, Turner and his closest lieutenants, men named Hark, Henry, Nelson, Sam, and Will, made their preparations. The planning was necessarily secretive, discussed only among the innermost circle. They could not risk word spreading beyond those they trusted completely, because discovery would mean death. They chose August for the uprising, believing that the harvest season would mean white families would be dispersed on their farms, making them more vulnerable. On August 13, 1831, another unusual atmospheric phenomenon occurred, a strange greenish tint to the sun, caused by atmospheric conditions that scientists would later explain, but that to Turner appeared as another divine sign. This was the final confirmation. The time had come. He set the date for August 21st, a Sunday night, when enslaved people traditionally had slightly more freedom of movement, and when white families would be sleeping peacefully in their beds. On the afternoon of August 20th, Turner met with his closest conspirators to finalize their plans. They gathered again on the 21st at a place called Cabin Pond, deep in the woods away from watching eyes. 6 men joined Turner initially, though they hoped others would join as the rebellion progressed. Their strategy was brutally simple. They would move from plantation to plantation, killing every white person they encountered, gathering weapons and horses, and recruiting more enslaved people to their cause. They believed that if they could strike quickly and decisively, if they could seize the arsenal in Jerusalem, the county seat, they might spark a general uprising across Southampton and beyond. At around 2 a.m. on August 22nd, the rebellion began. Turner led his small band to the home of Joseph Travis, who was technically Turner's owner, having acquired him through marriage. Travis, his wife, and their children slept unaware. The rebels entered the house and moved through it methodically. When they left, the entire Travis family was dead men, women, and children. This pattern would repeat through the night. The rebels moved to the next farm, and the next, following the roads through the darkness. At each plantation, they killed the white inhabitants and recruited enslaved men to join them. Some joined willingly, seeing an opportunity for freedom or vengeance. Others joined reluctantly, caught up in events beyond their control, fearing both the rebels and the inevitable white retaliation. The band grew 10 men, then 20, then perhaps as many as 60 or 70, though the exact numbers remain uncertain. They gathered weapons as they went: axes, knives, a few muskets and shotguns taken from the homes they raided. They took horses, improving their mobility. Through the pre-dawn hours and into Monday morning, they continued their systematic progress through the county. The killing was not indiscriminate. They targeted white people specifically, while generally sparing enslaved people, though there are accounts of enslaved workers who tried to protect their owners being killed alongside them. By Monday morning, news of the uprising began to spread. White families who had not yet been attacked fled their homes in terror, spreading alarm as they went. Rumors multiplied whispers of hundreds of rebels, of a massive slave army sweeping through the county. The reality was perhaps 60 insurgents, poorly armed and operating without clear military organization. But fear amplified the threat in white imaginations. The rebels' original goal was to reach Jerusalem, the county seat, where the arsenal held weapons that could arm a much larger force. But as Monday wore on, white resistance began to organize. Militia companies mobilized, gathering men from surrounding areas. Armed groups of white citizens formed impromptu patrols. By Monday afternoon, the rebellion's momentum had slowed. At Dr. Simon Blunt's plantation, the rebels encountered their first significant resistance. Blunt and his enslaved workers, who remained loyal to him, repulsed the attack. At least one rebel was killed, and several were captured. This was a turning point. The rebels' progress had been stopped, and white forces were converging on their position. By Tuesday, August 23rd, the rebellion was effectively over as an organized force. A confrontation near the home of Captain Newitt Harris scattered the rebel band. Some were killed in the fighting, others captured. The rest fled into the woods and swamps, hoping to evade capture. Turner himself, separated from his followers, went into hiding. The white response was swift and savage. Militia units, armed citizen patrols, and eventually federal troops converged on Southampton County. What followed was a reign of terror. White mobs and militia units killed black people indiscriminately, whether they had participated in the rebellion or not. Enslaved people were shot, beaten to death, decapitated. Some estimates suggest that as many as 120 to 200 black people enslaved and free were killed in retaliation, far more than the approximately 55 to 60 white people killed during the rebellion itself. The violence spread beyond Southampton County. Panic seized the white South. Rumors multiplied absurdly reports of slave armies marching on Wilmington, North Carolina, of uprisings spreading to Alabama. None of these rumors were true, but they triggered waves of violence against black communities. White vigilantes attacked free black settlements, burned homes, killed people on the slightest suspicion or no evidence at all. The editor of the Richmond Whig described the scene as the slaughter of many blacks without trial, and under circumstances of great barbarity. General Epps, commanding Virginia militia forces, eventually ordered a halt to the killing, recognizing that the indiscriminate violence was spiraling out of control. But by then, weeks had passed, and the death toll among innocent black people far exceeded the casualties from the rebellion itself. In the immediate aftermath, trials began. Enslaved people suspected of participating in the rebellion were brought before courts. The proceedings were swift, the verdicts largely predetermined. 18 enslaved men were officially executed by the Commonwealth of Virginia, hanged after trials that offered minimal opportunity for defense. Many more died in extra-legal killings by mobs. Nat Turner himself remained at large, a fugitive hiding in the woods and swamps of Southampton County. For nearly 2 months, he evaded capture, living in caves and improvised shelters, moving at night, desperate to avoid the patrols that searched for him. The white community could not rest easy while Turner remained free. He had become a symbol of their deepest fears, proof that even the most controlled system could be threatened by determined resistance. Turner was finally captured on October 30th, 1831, discovered hiding in a hole covered with fence rails. He offered no resistance, having been weakened by weeks of living rough with inadequate food. He was taken to Jerusalem and imprisoned, awaiting trial. While in jail, Turner was interviewed by Thomas R. Gray, a local lawyer who recorded what became known as the Confessions of Nat Turner. In this document, Turner described his visions, his planning, and his motivations. He showed no remorse, explaining his actions as divinely ordained. When asked if he regretted the rebellion, given its failure and the suffering it had caused, Turner replied that he did not. He had followed what he believed was God's command. Turner was tried on November 5, 1831. The proceedings took only a few hours. The verdict was guilty, the sentence death. On November 11, 1831, Nat Turner was hanged in Jerusalem. His body was reportedly dissected, his skin flayed and made into purses and other items as macabre souvenirs, a final dehumanization even in death. The rebellion and its suppression had profound effects on the institution of slavery and the South's response to it. In the immediate aftermath, Southern states passed a wave of new laws designed to tighten control over enslaved populations and restrict the rights of free black people. These laws prohibited teaching enslaved people to read or write. Turner's literacy had been seen as particularly dangerous. They restricted the movement of enslaved people, requiring passes for any travel off a plantation. They mandated that white ministers be present at any religious services for black people, fearing that black preachers like Turner could use religion to promote rebellion. They limited the rights of free black people to assemble, to testify in court, to own weapons. The rebellion also affected Northern abolitionists and the national debate over slavery. For some white Northerners who had been ambivalent about slavery, Turner's rebellion demonstrated the violence inherent in the system and the desperation of those held in bondage. For Southern defenders of slavery, the rebellion proved that enslaved people were dangerous and that the system required even stricter controls. The middle ground, the belief that slavery could be gradually reformed or peacefully ended, became harder to maintain. Turner's rebellion was not the first slave uprising in American history, nor would it be the last attempt at violent resistance, though it would prove to be the largest and deadliest in terms of white casualties. Earlier conspiracies, like Gabriel Prosser's planned rebellion in Virginia in 1800 and Denmark, Vesey's conspiracy in South Carolina in 1822, had been betrayed and suppressed before they could be carried out. Turner's rebellion differed in that it actually occurred, that blood was actually shed, that the nightmare scenario white Southerners feared was briefly made real. The question of how to understand Turner and his actions remains complex. To the white South of his time, he was a monster, a murderer who had killed innocent women and children. The brutality of the rebellion, the killing of infants and children along with adults, shocked even many who opposed slavery. To many in the enslaved community, Turner was a hero, a man who had dared to strike back against an inhumane system, who had chosen violent resistance over submission. Modern historians debate Turner's motivations and the nature of his religious visions. Some suggest he may have been mentally unstable, that his visions were symptoms of delusion. Others argue that his visions must be understood in the context of early 19th century religious culture, where prophetic experiences and direct divine communication were widely accepted. Still others emphasize the political and social context, a man held in permanent bondage, witnessing daily brutality, concluding that only violent overthrow could change the system. What seems clear is that Turner was not delusional in any simple sense. His visions had a coherent theological structure, drawing on Old Testament themes of divine judgment and liberation. His planning was careful and strategic, not the random violence of a disturbed mind. He maintained the loyalty and trust of his co-conspirators, suggesting he was persuasive and organized. And his interpretation of his visions as calling for rebellion was not incomprehensible given the reality of slavery. It was a radical religious response to a brutal social system. The legacy of Turner's rebellion extended far beyond 1831. It became a reference point in debates over slavery, invoked by abolitionists as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and by pro-slavery advocates as proof of the need for strict control. During the Civil War, some saw Turner as a precursor to the conflict, a prophet of the violent reckoning that would eventually come. In the 20th century, Turner became a symbol in African American history and literature, most notably in William Styron's controversial 1967 novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner. For the enslaved people of Southampton County and the wider South, the rebellion and its aftermath brought immediate suffering. The indiscriminate white violence, the tightened restrictions, the increased surveillance, all of these made daily life harder and more oppressive. And yet the rebellion also demonstrated that resistance was possible, that even the most controlled system had vulnerabilities, that enslaved people could organize and act. This knowledge, dangerous as it was, could not be entirely suppressed. Imagine yourself in the shoes of an enslaved person in Southampton County in late 1831, in the weeks and months after the rebellion. The terror is pervasive. White patrols roam constantly, suspicious of every movement, ready to respond to any perceived threat with violence. The new laws close off avenues of community and education. The memory of those killed in retaliation hangs heavy neighbors, family members, people who had nothing to do with the rebellion, but who died simply because they were black. And yet, beneath the fear, there might also be a strange kind of pride or awe. Someone had tried. Someone had struck back. For 48 hours, the system had been shaken. For Turner's co-conspirators, those who survived the initial violence, the end was predetermined. They were tried, most convicted, many hanged. Their names, Hark, Henry, Nelson, Sam, Will, and others, are recorded in court documents, brief glimpses of men who chose to risk everything for a chance at freedom. What they said in their final moments, what they thought as they faced execution, remains largely unrecorded. They were property that had rebelled, and the punishment was death. The night of August 21st to 22nd, 1831, thus represents a moment when the underlying violence of slavery erupted into open conflict. For most of the time, slavery maintained itself through the constant threat of violence rather than its constant application. But Turner's rebellion made that violence explicit and immediate. Both the rebellion itself and the savage repression that followed revealed the brutality that the system rested upon enslaved people willing to kill for freedom, white people willing to kill indiscriminately to maintain control. As the months passed, as the immediate panic subsided, life on southern plantations returned to its grim rhythms. The fields still needed to be worked, the crops still needed to be harvested. Enslaved people went back to their labor, but now under even stricter surveillance, with fewer rights and less freedom of movement than before. The rebellion had failed to overthrow slavery, but it had succeeded in demonstrating that enslaved people would resist, that the system required constant vigilance and violence to maintain. Nat Turner died on November 11, 1831, but his name would resonate through American history. The rebellion he led lasted less than 2 days, but its impact shaped slavery policy and debate for the 3 decades until the Civil War. It stands as the most significant violent slave uprising in American history, not because it succeeded, it did not, but because it happened at all, because it demonstrated that even in the most controlled circumstances, human beings would fight for freedom, whatever the cost. The story of Nat Turner and his rebellion is one of violence begetting violence, of a brutal system producing desperate resistance, of religious faith interpreted as a call to revolutionary action. It offers no comfortable lessons, no easy morals. It simply reveals the reality of slavery in stark terms. It was a system maintained by force, and it generated resistance that was also forceful. The 48 hours of Turner's rebellion were an eruption of that underlying violence, a brief moment when the enslaved fought back with everything they had and paid a terrible price for it. Not all resistance to slavery took the form of open rebellion. While Nat Turner's uprising represented violent confrontation, another form of resistance operated quietly, persistently, year after year. A network of roots, safe houses, and courageous individuals helping enslaved people escape to freedom. This network came to be known as the Underground Railroad, though it was neither underground nor a railroad, but rather a loose collection of people and places united by a common purpose: to move human beings from bondage to liberty. The Underground Railroad existed in the shadows, operating through secrecy and coded communication. Those who participated developed their own terminology to describe what they were doing, borrowing the language of railroads that were transforming American transportation in the mid-19th century. Enslaved people seeking freedom were called passengers or cargo. Those who guided them were conductors. Safe houses were stations or depots, and the people who maintained these hiding places were station masters. Routes themselves were called lines. This coded language served a practical purpose. If a letter was intercepted or a conversation overheard, the discussion of passengers and stations might seem innocent. The network emerged gradually over decades, beginning in the late 18th century and reaching its peak of activity in the 1840s and 1850s. It was never a single organized system with central leadership or coordination. Instead, it was a patchwork of local networks, individuals who knew the next safe house along a particular route, but might know little about what happened before or after their segment of the journey. This compartmentalization provided security. If someone was captured and interrogated, they could reveal only the small portion of the network they knew. Imagine yourself as an enslaved person contemplating escape. The decision is agonizing. Success means freedom, but failure means brutal punishment, whipping, branding, being sold away from family to the Deep South, or even death. Most enslaved people never attempted escape, held in place by the difficulty of the journey, the fear of being caught, and the desperate hope that somehow, someday, freedom might come without such terrible risk. But some, driven by unbearable circumstances or unquenchable desire for liberty, decided to try. Planning an escape required careful preparation. You would need to gather information about routes north, about where you might find help. This knowledge might come from other enslaved people, whispered conversations about someone who had successfully escaped, rumors of white abolitionists or free black people who might provide assistance. You would need to choose a time many escapees left in winter, when longer nights provided more hours of darkness for traveling, though the cold brought its own dangers. Some chose Saturday nights, because runaway advertisements would not appear in newspapers until Monday, giving a crucial head start. You would travel at night, guided by the North Star. At fixed point in the northern sky, it showed the way to free territory. The star appears directly over the North Pole, so following it meant traveling northward, toward the Free States and Canada. On cloudy nights, when stars were invisible, you might follow other indicators, moss growing on the north side of trees, the flow of rivers and streams. The journey was exhausting and terrifying. You would cover perhaps 10 to 20 miles in a night, moving through forests and fields, avoiding roads where patrols might spot you. Behind you, the threat of pursuit was constant. Slave catchers' men who made their living hunting down escapees would be alerted once your absence was discovered. They used dogs trained to track human scent, bloodhounds that could follow a trail for miles. The sound of those dogs baying in the distance was a sound that filled escapees with dread. To throw the dogs off the scent, escapees employed various tactics. Some waded through streams and rivers, letting the water wash away their scent trail. Some rubbed their feet with strong-smelling substances like onion or pepper. Some split up and traveled in different directions, hoping to confuse pursuers about which trail to follow. These techniques sometimes worked, sometimes failed. The advantage always lay with the pursuers. They were mounted, rested, well-fed, armed, and legally authorized to hunt you down. As dawn approached, you would need to find a hiding place to rest during daylight hours. Traveling in daylight was too dangerous. You would be visible to anyone who saw you, and any white person had the legal authority to demand proof that you were allowed to be traveling. Without a written pass from an owner, you would be detained as a suspected runaway. So the day was spent hidden, in a cave, in a thick stand of trees, in a swamp, anywhere you could remain concealed and hope that no one would stumble upon you. If you were fortunate, you might have made contact with a conductor, someone who actively helped enslaved people escape. Some conductors were free black people who risked their own liberty to help others gain freedom. Some were white abolitionists, people who opposed slavery on moral or religious grounds and were willing to break the law to help. These conductors sometimes traveled into slave states themselves, a dangerous mission that could result in their being attacked, arrested, or killed. A conductor might disguise themselves as an enslaved person to enter a plantation and make contact with someone planning to escape. They would share information about the route, about where safe houses could be found, about what signals to use to identify friendly homes. Some conductors personally guided groups of escapees along the route, leading them from one station to the next. The stations varied widely in their nature and organization. Some were farmhouses whose owners quietly provided shelter in a barn or cellar. Some were churches where sympathetic ministers would hide escapees in hidden rooms or attics. Some were homes of free black people who understood intimately what it meant to help others escape bondage. These stations provided crucial services: food, rest, sometimes medical attention for injuries or illnesses sustained during the journey. Station masters took considerable risks. Harboring a fugitive slave was a crime under federal law, punishable by substantial fines and imprisonment. Despite these risks, some station masters helped dozens or even hundreds of escapees over the years, motivated by religious conviction, abolitionist principles, or simple human compassion. They developed ingenious hiding places, false walls and hidden rooms, cellars accessible only through concealed trapdoors, spaces in attics that could be quickly sealed off to evade search. Communication between stations relied on various methods. Messages might be sent in coded letters discussing parcels arriving on certain dates. Sometimes a conductor would travel ahead to the next station to alert them that passengers were coming. Other times, escapees would simply arrive at a designated place and give a prearranged signal-specific knock pattern, a particular phrase, a gesture recognized only by those in the network. One of the most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman, herself an escapee from slavery, who repeatedly returned to slave territory to guide others to freedom. Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, and she escaped to Philadelphia in 1849. But freedom was not enough for her. She made it her mission to help others escape, particularly her family members. Over approximately 13 trips between 1850 and 1860, Tubman personally guided around 70 people to freedom. Tubman's methods combined careful planning with remarkable courage. She carried a revolver, not primarily to fight slave catchers, that would have been futile against armed groups, but to enforce discipline among those she was guiding. If someone in the group wanted to turn back, threatening the safety of everyone else, Tubman would point the gun at them and declare, "Go on or die." She understood that one person's weakness or fear could lead to the capture of the entire group, and she would not allow it. This ruthless pragmatism, combined with deep compassion for those she helped, made her extraordinarily effective. She used disguises to avoid detection, dressing as a man or as an old woman with a bonnet, carrying live chickens to appear as if she were simply running errands. She chose her timing carefully, starting escapes on Saturday evenings so that runaway advertisements would not appear in newspapers until Monday. She worked primarily in winter, when long nights provided more hours of darkness for travel. These tactical decisions, accumulated through experience and careful thought, improved the odds of success. Tubman became legendary among both enslaved people and abolitionists. She was known for never losing a passenger. Everyone she guided reached freedom. This perfect record was extraordinary given the dangers involved, and it made her a symbol of hope and possibility. Stories of Moses, as she was sometimes called in reference to the biblical liberator, spread through the enslaved community, inspiring others to attempt their own escapes. The commonly repeated claim that there was a $40,000 bounty on Tubman's head is likely mythical. The only documented reward for her capture was a $100 offer for her return shortly after her own escape. But the myth itself is revealing. It shows how feared she was by slaveholders, how large her reputation grew. In reality, most slaveholders on the eastern shore of Maryland did not know that Minty Ross, as they had known her, was the person helping slaves escape. Her anonymity was her protection. Routes of the Underground Railroad followed geographical features and existing transportation networks. Major routes ran north from border states like Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky into Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. From there, routes continued to Canada, which offered security that even northern free states could not guarantee. Other routes ran along the Atlantic coast, using ships and boats to move escapees northward. The Maritime Underground Railroad utilized sailors, ship captains, and dock workers to hide fugitives aboard vessels. The number of people who successfully escaped via the Underground Railroad is impossible to determine with certainty. Estimates range from 30,000 to 100,000 over the network's entire existence, though records are incomplete by the nature of clandestine operations. For every person who successfully reached freedom, many more were caught and returned to slavery, their escape attempts ending in punishment and often being sold away from family as further punishment and to prevent future attempts. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 dramatically changed the landscape of escape. Passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, this federal law required citizens of free states to assist in capturing escaped slaves. It authorized federal commissioners to issue warrants for the arrest of suspected fugitives and denied accused fugitives the right to a jury trial or even the right to testify on their own behalf. Anyone who helped an escaped slave could be fined $1,000, an enormous sum at the time, and imprisoned for 6 months. The act's impact was profound and multifaceted. For escapees who had reached northern free states and built new lives, the law meant they were no longer safe. Slave catchers could now operate legally in the North, and they did, traveling to northern cities to capture people who had been living as free for years. Some of these captures were legitimate enslaved people who had escaped and were being returned. Others were kidnappings free, black people seized and falsely claimed as slaves, with no legal recourse to prove their freedom. The act created a climate of terror in northern black communities. Many who had escaped slavery years earlier now fled further north to Canada, abandoning homes and livelihoods to stay beyond the reach of the law. Estimates suggest that 20,000 or more black Americans migrated to Canada in the wake of the act, choosing exile over the risk of being captured and sent south. But the Fugitive Slave Act also had an unintended consequence for slaveholders. It galvanized northern opposition to slavery. Many white Northerners who had been indifferent to slavery when it remained confined to the South were outraged by being compelled to participate in its enforcement. The act forced them to choose sides, and many chose to resist rather than cooperate. Vigilance committees formed in northern cities, organizations dedicated to protecting fugitive slaves from capture. These committees would provide legal assistance, help escapees flee to Canada before they could be apprehended, and sometimes physically intervene to prevent captures. In some cases, crowds gathered to prevent slave catchers from taking their prey, surrounding courthouses where fugitives were held and demanding their release. Several dramatic rescues occurred, fugitives freed from custody by mobs of abolitionists and sympathetic citizens. The Underground Railroad's operations became more sophisticated in response to the 1850 Act. The final destination for most escapees shifted from northern free states to Canada, which was beyond the reach of American law. Routes were extended and refined. Communication systems became more organized. The danger increased, but so did the determination of those involved. Some elements of Underground Railroad mythology are less firmly grounded than others. The idea of quilts with coded patterns hung outside to signal safe houses is popular but disputed by historians, who find little contemporary evidence for this practice. Similarly, the notion that certain spirituals, like Follow the Drinking Gourd, contain specific directions for escape routes is debated. These songs certainly expressed longing for freedom, but whether they served as actual coded maps is uncertain. What is clear is that escapees needed real, practical information about routes, safe houses, and methods. And this information was passed through networks of trust. The role of free black communities in the Underground Railroad cannot be overstated. Free black people, particularly in border states and northern cities, formed the backbone of many Underground Railroad operations. They had the knowledge and connections to help escapees, and they understood viscerally what was at stake. Free black churches often served as stations or organizing centers. Free black individuals served as conductors, station masters, and providers of resources. Their motivation was personal. Many had been enslaved themselves, or had family members still in bondage. White abolitionists also played crucial roles, particularly in providing resources and legal protection that black conductors could not access. Wealthy white abolitionists funded Underground Railroad operations, paying for transportation, food, and shelter. White lawyers defended captured fugitives in court. White ministers preached against slavery and provided church buildings as stations. The Underground Railroad was genuinely interracial in its operations. Though the risks were not equally distributed, a white person caught helping slaves might face fines and imprisonment, while a black person caught doing the same might be enslaved themselves if free, or face death if already enslaved. The geography of escape was shaped by the proximity to free territory. Enslaved people in border states like Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky had the shortest distance to travel to reach freedom, and consequently, these states saw the highest rates of escape attempts. Those held in the deep South Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana faced far more daunting journeys, hundreds of miles through slave territory before reaching even a border state. For them, escape was nearly impossible, and few even attempted it. Some escapees used clever disguises and deceptions. Light-skinned black people sometimes posed as white travelers, a dangerous gambit that worked only if they could convincingly play the role and avoid close scrutiny. Some escapees dressed as the opposite gender to confuse pursuers. Some traveled in boxes or crates, literally shipping themselves north as freight, a method made famous by Henry Box Brown, who had himself nailed into a wooden crate and shipped from Richmond to Philadelphia in 1849. The journey north was not just physically perilous, but psychologically wrenching. Escapees left behind family members, knowing they might never see them again. The choice to escape often meant abandoning a spouse, children, parents, or siblings who could not come along. This separation was agonizing, but for many, the pull of freedom was stronger than the pain of leaving. Some, like Harriet Tubman, returned repeatedly to bring family members out. Others never saw their loved ones again, carrying that loss for the rest of their lives. For those who successfully reached Canada or established themselves in northern communities, freedom brought both joy and challenges. They had to build new lives with nothing, no possessions, no money, often no skills beyond agricultural labor. They faced discrimination and prejudice, even in free territory. But they also had autonomy, legal personhood, the ability to control their own lives and labor. They could marry legally, own property, testify in court, move freely. These rights, which free people took for granted, were precious beyond measure to those who had lived without them. The Underground Railroad operated for approximately 70 years, from the 1780s to the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. As the war began, and Union armies moved into Confederate territory, the Underground Railroad's role shifted. Enslaved people no longer needed to flee hundreds of miles north. They could reach Union lines, which offered a form of freedom and protection. Thousands did so, becoming contrabands of war in the awkward legal terminology of the time. Not yet free citizens, but no longer property either. The legacy of the Underground Railroad resonates through American history as a testament to human courage and resistance. It demonstrated that even the most oppressive systems have vulnerabilities, that determined individuals can subvert unjust laws, that networks of mutual aid can achieve what seems impossible. Every person who successfully escaped was a victory against the system, a living refutation of the claim that enslaved people accepted their bondage. The stories of those who participated, conductors like Harriet Tubman, station masters who opened their homes to strangers at great personal risk, the thousands of nameless passengers who walked hundreds of miles toward freedom. These stories reveal both the horror of slavery and the resilience of human beings facing it. The Underground Railroad was not underground, not a railroad, but it was real, and it was a lifeline that carried thousands from bondage to freedom, one perilous journey at a time. Now we turn our gaze from the fields and the quarters, from rebellion and escape, to the structure that dominated the landscape of every plantation, the big house. This mansion, often visible from miles away with its white columns gleaming in the sunlight, represented the wealth and power of the plantation owner. It was built by enslaved labor, maintained by enslaved labor, and its very existence depended entirely on the system of human bondage we have been examining. Yet those who lived within it cultivated an image of refinement, culture, and gracious living that carefully obscured the brutality that made it possible. The architecture of the plantation big house reached its most characteristic form in the antebellum period, roughly from the 1830s to 1860. These homes embodied the Greek Revival style that swept across the American South during this era. The choice of architectural style was not accidental or merely aesthetic. It carried profound symbolic meaning. The planters who built these houses saw themselves as inheritors of classical civilization as democratic republicans in the tradition of ancient Athens and Rome. The irony that both ancient civilizations had been slave societies, and that American planters spoke of liberty while holding humans in bondage, seems to have been lost on them, or perhaps it made the comparison more appealing. Approaching a typical plantation mansion, you would see it positioned prominently, often on a rise or hill that elevated it above the surrounding landscape. This positioning was practical. It caught breezes that helped cool the interior in the oppressive southern heat. But it was also symbolic, a physical representation of the social hierarchy. The master's house looked down upon the fields and the slave quarters, visible but distant, observing but separate. The facade typically featured massive white columns supporting a wide portico that ran across the front of the house. These columns, modeled after ancient Greek temples, were imposing and elegant. They were usually in the Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian style, and they required substantial resources and skilled labor to construct. Enslaved craftsmen built these columns, shaped the capitals, erected the structures that symbolized their own subjugation. The symmetry of the design was crucial. Greek Revival architecture emphasized perfect balance and proportion. Windows were evenly spaced, identical on each side of a central entrance. The entrance itself was grand tall double doors, often with a fanlight window above, providing both light and ventilation. Everything about the design communicated order, control, rationality, the same qualities the planter class claimed to exercise over their human property. Inside, the layout followed established patterns. A central hallway ran from the front entrance to the rear of the house, creating a passage for airflow that helped cool the interior. This hallway served as a reception area where visitors would wait, and it was typically decorated to impress fine wallpaper or painted walls, polished wooden floors, perhaps a chandelier suspended from the high ceiling. Off this central hall, rooms opened on either side parlors for receiving guests, a dining room for elaborate meals, perhaps a library or study for the master of the house. The rooms were furnished with pieces that demonstrated wealth and taste. Furniture might be imported from Europe or crafted by skilled artisans in American cities. Fabrics were rich silk, velvet, damask. Carpets covered the floors. Mirrors and gilt frames reflected candlelight or lamplight, multiplying the illumination. Oil paintings hung on the walls portraits of family members, landscapes, perhaps classical or biblical scenes. These were displays of cultivation, of membership in a class that had the leisure and resources for aesthetic appreciation. The library, where one existed, held particular significance. Books were expensive, and a substantial collection demonstrated education and intellectual sophistication. A planter might own volumes of classical literature, Homer, Virgil, Cicero alongside histories, scientific treatises, and contemporary literature. Ironically, many of these planters who read classical Republican philosophy and spoke eloquently about liberty and the rights of man saw no contradiction in owning human beings. They developed elaborate intellectual justifications for this contradiction, arguing that slavery was a positive good, that enslaved Africans were naturally inferior and benefited from the civilizing influence of enslavement, that the system was ordained by biblical precedent. This paternalistic ideology was central to how slaveholders understood themselves and their role. They did not see themselves as tyrants or oppressors, but as benevolent patriarchs exercising necessary authority over childlike beings who could not care for themselves. They spoke of their enslaved people as members of an extended family, as dependents who required guidance and protection. This familial language masked the economic reality that enslaved people were property, bought and sold for profit, worked for the enrichment of their owners, and had no familiar rights that their owners were bound to respect. The master of a large plantation often saw himself as fulfilling multiple roles: businessman managing a complex agricultural operation, patriarch overseeing a large household, civic leader participating in local and state politics, and gentleman of culture and refinement. These men dominated Southern politics, holding state legislative seats, governorships, seats in Congress. They shaped laws to protect their interests, particularly the institution of slavery. They wielded enormous power, not just over their own enslaved workers, but over Southern society as a whole. Yet beneath this power and confidence often lay financial precarity. Many planters lived on credit, perpetually in debt to factors and merchants who financed their operations. Cotton was lucrative when prices were high, but prices fluctuated based on factors beyond any individual planter's control, whether international markets, economic downturns. A bad crop year could mean disaster. Some planters were forced to sell enslaved people to pay debts, breaking up families not out of cruelty, but out of financial necessity, which from the perspective of those sold, made no difference at all. The financial arrangements were complex. Planters typically operated on credit extended by factors intermediaries who marketed the crop and provided financing for the next planting season. The planter would ship his cotton or tobacco to the factor, who would sell it and deduct commissions, interest on credit extended, and charges for goods purchased on the planter's behalf. What remained would be credited to the planter's account, and this credit would fund the next year's operations. In good years, this system generated substantial profits. In poor years, it generated mounting debt. Some plantation fortunes were real and substantial. Others were facades concealing financial distress. The mistress of the house oversaw the domestic operations, a role that was demanding despite the presence of enslaved servants to perform the actual labor. She managed the household staff, directed the preparation of meals, supervised the spinning, weaving, and sewing that produced cloth and clothing, cared for sick family members, and maintained the social relationships that were crucial to the family's standing. This was invisible labor in the sense that it was not recognized as work in the way a man's management of field operations was, but it was essential to the plantation's functioning. The enslaved people who worked in the big house occupied an ambiguous position in the plantation hierarchy. House servants, cooks, maids, valets, butlers, nurses worked in closer proximity to the white family than field workers did. They were often better dressed, receiving cast-off clothing from the family or being given clothing appropriate to their visible roles. They typically ate better, having access to kitchen scraps and leftovers that field workers never saw. They were less exposed to the weather, working primarily indoors. For these reasons, house service was often seen as preferable to field work. But this proximity came with its own costs. House servants had virtually no privacy and little respite from their labor. While field workers returned to their own quarters at the end of the workday, house servants often lived in the big house itself, sleeping in small rooms in the attic or basement, always on call. They were subject to constant surveillance and the whims of family members at all hours. They performed intimate services, dressing and undressing their owners, attending to bodily functions, sleeping in the same room to be available if needed during the night. This intimacy did not create affection or respect. It created a different kind of violation, a complete erasure of personal boundaries. The cook worked in a separate kitchen building, often located behind the main house. This separation was necessary because of the heat and fire danger from cooking fires. The kitchen was hot, dangerous work managing wood-fired ovens and open hearths, preparing elaborate multi-course meals for the white family and their frequent guests. A skilled cook was valuable property, and some plantation cooks achieved remarkable culinary expertise, creating sophisticated dishes that drew on African, European, and American traditions. Yet this skill brought no freedom, no wages, no security. At any moment, a skilled cook could be sold to pay a debt or given away as a wedding gift. Children were present in the big house in multiple capacities. The white children of the family played in the rooms and grounds, educated by tutors or occasionally by educated enslaved people. Enslaved children worked as servants from young ages, perhaps as young as 8 years old, performing light tasks like hauling firewood, sweeping, running errands, and attending to the white children. Sometimes enslaved and white children played together in early childhood, before the rigid racial hierarchy was fully imposed. But as they grew older, the relationship transformed from playmates to master and slave. Wet nurses enslaved women who breastfed white infants represented one of the most intimate and vice, troubling aspects of house service. A white woman who chose not to nurse her own child, or who could not due to illness or insufficient milk, would have an enslaved woman perform this function. Often this meant that the enslaved woman's own infant received less attention and nourishment, subordinated to the needs of the white child. The wet nurse lived in constant proximity to the white family, her own child separated from her. Her body used to sustain someone else's baby. The daily routine of the big house revolved around elaborate social rituals. Breakfast, dinner, and supper were formal occasions, even when only family was present, served by enslaved waiters who stood silent and attentive throughout the meal. When guests were present, which was frequent Southern hospitality, was a point of pride, the meals became even more elaborate. Multiple courses, fine china and silver, crystal glassware, wine from the cellar. Enslaved servants moved through the dining room, serving and clearing with practiced efficiency, maintaining an almost invisible presence despite being constantly in the room. Evening entertainment might include music, perhaps a piano in the parlor, played by the daughters of the family who had received instruction as part of their education as genteel young ladies. Or there might be reading aloud, or conversation about politics, or card games. The white family and their guests occupied themselves with pursuits that signaled their distance from labor, their membership in a class defined by leisure. Meanwhile, enslaved servants remained on duty, maintaining fires, providing refreshments, attending to needs. The gardens surrounding the plantation house were designed with geometric precision, formal arrangements of hedges and flowers that required constant maintenance. Enslaved gardeners kept these spaces manicured, creating outdoor areas where the white family could stroll or sit in the shade. The contrast between these carefully controlled gardens and the raw agricultural landscape of the fields was deliberate. Gardens represented civilization and refinement imposed upon nature, just as the planters believed they imposed order and civilization upon enslaved Africans. Religious observance was part of the household routine, though its character varied. Some planters attended church regularly, sitting in prominent pews, while enslaved people sat in galleries or in a separate area. Sermons directed at enslaved congregants emphasized obedience, patience, and the rewards of the afterlife. Carefully curated theology designed to discourage resistance and rebellion. Some enslaved people internalized these messages. Others heard different meanings in biblical texts, finding themes of liberation and justice that white preachers carefully avoided. The big house had numerous outbuildings serving various functions. The kitchen, as mentioned, was typically separate. There might also be a smokehouse for preserving meat, an ice house for keeping things cool, a laundry house where enslaved women scrubbed clothing and linens, a dairy where butter and cheese were made, workshops where repairs and manufacturing occurred. All of this constituted the domestic industrial complex of the plantation, and all of it operated through enslaved labor. The slave quarters stood at a distance from the big house, usually not visible from the front of the mansion. These cabins were crude structures, dirt-floored and poorly chinked, housing multiple families in cramped conditions. The architectural contrast with the big house was stark and deliberate. The difference in living conditions physically manifested the social hierarchy. Visitors to the plantation might tour the big house and gardens, admiring the elegance and refinement, and never see the quarters where the people who made that elegance possible lived in poverty and degradation. Social events at the plantation were occasions for displaying wealth and maintaining social networks. A barbecue might involve roasting whole animals, serving hundreds of guests who arrived from neighboring plantations. A ball might feature an orchestra, elaborate decorations, and dancing that continued until dawn. Young people courted under the watchful eyes of parents and chaperones. Marriages were arranged between planter families, consolidating wealth and forming alliances. These events required enormous amounts of labor, cooking, serving, cleaning, all performed by enslaved people who would clean up after the guests departed and return to their own very different lives. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system is striking from a modern perspective. Men who spoke eloquently about liberty, who revered the founding fathers and the principles of the Declaration of Independence, held human beings in bondage. They justified this through elaborate racial theories that claimed inherent differences between races, through biblical interpretations that found divine sanction for slavery, through paternalistic arguments that they were caring for people who could not care for themselves. They had to believe these justifications, had to convince themselves that what they were doing was right and necessary, because the alternative, acknowledging that they were perpetrating a massive injustice, would have been psychologically intolerable. Some planters were more brutal than others, some more kind by the standards of the system, but these individual variations did not change the fundamental nature of slavery. Even a kind master owned human beings as property, could sell them at will, could have them whipped for disobedience, could separate families, could violate enslaved women with impunity. The system itself was the problem. An individual temperament merely modulated the degree of suffering within an inherently brutal institution. The plantation economy was extraordinarily profitable for those at the top. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the largest cotton-producing states contained more wealth per capita than anywhere else in the United States. This wealth was concentrated in the hands of the planter elite, a relatively small number of families who owned large plantations, and many enslaved people. The majority of white Southerners did not own slaves, or owned only a few, and they did not share in this wealth. But the system shaped the entire society, creating a rigid hierarchy based on race that gave even the poorest white person a psychological advantage over any black person, enslaved or free. As tensions over slavery intensified in the 1850s, as the abolitionist movement grew in the North, and political conflicts over the expansion of slavery into new territories became more bitter, the planter elite grew increasingly defensive. They doubled down on their justifications for slavery, arguing that it was not merely necessary, but positive, that enslaved people were better off than free workers in northern factories, that the Southern social system was superior to Northern capitalism. These arguments convinced few outside the South, but hardened Southern commitment to the institution. Life in the big house continued its rhythms, the meals served, the social events hosted, the business of the plantation conducted. The master might spend his days reviewing account books, directing overseers, corresponding with factors about crop sales, participating in local politics. The mistress might spend hers directing household staff, visiting with neighbors, overseeing the education of children, attending to charitable activities that brought her social recognition. The enslaved staff moved through the house performing their duties, maintaining the facade of gracious living. The children of the planter class grew up in this environment, absorbing its values and assumptions. They learned from early childhood that black people were inferior, that enslaved people existed to serve white people, that this hierarchy was natural and divinely ordained. They learned the manners and expectations of their class, how to behave at dinner, how to converse politely, how to manage subordinates. The boys would eventually inherit plantations or establish their own. The girls would marry into other planter families, bringing dowries that often included enslaved people given as wedding gifts, human beings transferred as property. The big house stood as a monument to wealth extracted from enslaved labor. Every elegant room, every fine piece of furniture, every social gathering represented the unpaid work of hundreds of people over generations. The white columns, symbols of classical civilization and republican virtue, were built by people held in bondage. The food served at elaborate dinners was cooked by enslaved women. The gardens were maintained by enslaved workers. The entire edifice of Southern elite life rested on a foundation of human exploitation. And yet, those who lived in the big house did not see themselves as exploiters. They saw themselves as fulfilling their proper role in a social order they believed was natural and right. They took pride in their hospitality, their cultivation, their honor. They spoke of their duties to their dependents. They convinced themselves that the system benefited everyone, that enslaved people were content in their roles, that any resistance or discontent came from outside agitators rather than from the inherent injustice of the situation. This self-deception was necessary for the system to function, and it was remarkably complete. The contrast between the big house and the slave quarters, between the lives of the planter elite and the lives of those they enslaved, could not have been more stark. One group lived in spacious, elegant surroundings, ate abundant and varied food, wore fine clothing, pursued education and leisure, exercised power over others, and could look forward to passing wealth and status to their children. The other group lived in crowded, poorly built cabins, subsisted on inadequate rations, wore rough homespun, labored from dawn to dusk, had no power over their own lives, and could only pass bondage to their children. These two realities existed side by side, intimately connected yet worlds apart. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, reflect on that contrast. The plantation system created extremes of wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness, comfort and suffering. The big house with its white columns and gracious rooms was beautiful to look at, carefully designed to impress and inspire. But that beauty was purchased with brutality, that elegance sustained by exploitation. Understanding this contradiction, how human beings could create such refined civilization while perpetrating such injustice, is essential to understanding American history and the legacy that still shapes the present. The big house still stands at many former plantations, preserved now as museums or historical sites. Visitors tour the rooms, admire the architecture, learn about the families who lived there. Many of these sites now also tell the story of the enslaved people who made the plantation function, the people whose labor built and sustained everything. It is a more complete story, though still an incomplete one, because the full weight of slavery's brutality and the full measure of enslaved people's humanity can never be entirely captured in museum displays. But the attempt is made, the acknowledgement offered, that these houses of privilege were also houses of oppression, and that both truths must be told. We have traveled a long road tonight through the brutal world of American slavery. We began in the fields, feeling the rhythm of endless labor under the overseer's gaze. We witnessed Nat Turner's desperate rebellion and its terrible aftermath. We walked the Underground Railroad's dangerous paths toward freedom, and we stood in the big house, seeing how wealth and refinement could coexist with profound injustice. These stories from the past speak to fundamental questions about human nature, about how systems of oppression function, about resistance and complicity, about suffering and survival. They are not easy stories, not comforting narratives, but they are true, and truth, however difficult, is worth knowing. As you drift towards sleep now, know that the world you inhabit is different. You live in a time and place where human bondage is illegal, where the rights and dignity of all people are at least acknowledged in law, if not always in practice. The struggles of the past shaped the present, and the courage of those who resisted slavery, whether through rebellion, escape, or simply surviving, contributed to the world you now experience. Let the knowledge of what came before deepen your appreciation for what exists now. Let the stories of those who suffered and fought inspire gratitude for the progress that has been made and determination to address the injustices that remain. History is not just about the past. It illuminates the present and guides the future. And now rest. Let your mind settle. Let the images and stories gently fade into the background as sleep approaches. You are safe, comfortable and free. Those who lived the history we explored tonight or not, but their stories have been told, their experiences acknowledged, their humanity affirmed. Remember them as you drift off and sleep peacefully in the knowledge that their struggles, their resistance, and their resilience matter. They are part of the long human story of seeking dignity and freedom, a story that continues still. Good night.